All right. We'll give it 1 minute, let everybody load up on the webinar, and then we'll get started. But thank you guys for coming in. Grab your coffee. For those of you who are online, it's pretty nice out here in Times Square. So my name is Ross Nodorf. Thank you for coming. I work at Venable, and I'm happy to host a little bit of this today. And we're very happy to partner with the Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law and Columbia. And we're going to get started by having both of those folks get up and talk to us a little bit about what's going to happen today. And we'll start with Irva. So Irva, come on up, and why don't you kick us off?
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs and our esteemed partners, Venable and Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our conference on cyber regulation and the electrical grid. My name is Irva Khan. I'm the coordinator of the cyber program at SIPA. I'd like to start by acknowledging Jason Healy, senior researcher at Columbia, who unfortunately couldn't be here with us today. However, I'm happy to report he is recovering. He recently had surgery and sends his apologies for missing this event. We're so pleased to have you here with us today in New York City and joining virtually, especially at a time when the cybersecurity challenges facing our critical infrastructure are more pressing than ever. Today, we'll be exploring an evolving threat landscape, the regulatory coordination required to secure our grid, and the policy and technology challenges shaping the future of grid security. As many of you know, this is actually our second conference on this vital topic. Back in November, we hosted our inaugural conference on cyber regulation and harmonization. We built the essential foundation discussing the need to align and simplify the increasingly complex patchwork of cyber rules. This year, we're taking the next critical step. Our focus shifts from broad harmonization to the specific existential challenges of the electrical grid. We meet at a time of escalating threats, highlighted by the activities of actors like Volt Typhoon and a clear call from leaders like the National Cyber Director to streamline the regulatory burden while ensuring vital security. We must find the sweet spot where security is robust and compliance is effective, not just exhaustive. At SIPA, we made a concerted effort to ensure that regulation is at the heart of these conversations. Not only are we involved in a variety of research projects related to cyber risk and cyber policy, but we're also proud of initiatives like our Cybersecurity Regulation newsletter, a first-of-its-kind student-led publication that regularly delves into the intersection of cybersecurity and regulation. Our lead writer, research assistant, and soon-to-be graduate Samuel Jab is here with us today, so if you have any questions about our newsletter, feel free to find him. Just this year, the Cyber 912 Strategy Challenge, which is a competition for students about a cascading cyber incident scenario, it focused specifically on the electrical grid. So we're actively training the next generation of policy leaders for challenges like the ones we'll discuss today. Let's look at the roadmap for our crucial morning. We'll kick off after these remarks with a threat brief from Christine Martz of Dragos, giving us the latest on intelligence on what we're up against. Then we dive into two panels. The first panel is a deep dive into the update on cyber regulation and the grid, exploring how the push for efficiency will play out for energy companies, how states will get involved, and what recommendations are coming directly from companies closest to the challenge. Panel 2 zeroes in on the intense balancing act regulators and companies face, juggling the pressures of security, resilience, the booming demand from AI, and the mandate for clean energy transition. This is the forum to discuss how to ensure cybersecurity requirements do not get ignored. We have fantastic panelists with a wealth of experience. We thank you all for being here. And I have no doubt that today's discussions will be thought-provoking and spark ideas for new approaches to policy and technology that can help safeguard the grid and its users. We encourage all of you to engage, ask questions, and make the most of this event. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to Caitlin Clark from Venable to say a few words.
Thank you, Irva, and good morning, everyone. It's a privilege to open today's event on cyber regulation and the electrical grid, hosted here at Venable with the Center for Cyber Policy and Law and the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. Thank you for joining us to discuss what has become one of the defining challenges in our national security and energy future: protecting the grid from the growing wave of cyber threats. Now, when I woke up this morning in New York City, I followed my normal routine. I hit the snooze button on my alarm a couple times, turned on the lights, took the world's slowest elevator. All along the way, I relied on the energy sector to power my morning without even thinking about it. And it's the same for individuals, businesses, and communities around the country. But while we may not think every day about the critical role energy plays in our lives and our economy, our adversaries are. In my previous role as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Cyber and Emerging Technology on the National Security Council, this was abundantly clear. Our adversaries have the intent and the capability to disrupt our critical infrastructure. Last January, then FBI Director Christopher Wray testified that the U.S. intelligence community had observed the Chinese Communist Party target multiple critical infrastructure entities, attacks which could potentially jeopardize the physical safety of Americans. This week, on 60 Minutes, General Tim Hawk said of Chinese threat actors, they are certainly attempting every single day to be able to target telecommunications, to be able to target critical infrastructure, both in the US and in other countries, and they are doing that to try to ensure that they have an advantage in a crisis or a conflict. And for years in Washington, we've had 2027 as the date for that ticking clock on potential conflict. Now, I don't know about you, but we are here October 2025. 2027 is very close. It's less than 2 years away, which does not seem like that long, but it is very close. So I want to say cybersecurity is not a secondary concern for the energy sector. It's a core operating condition. In its 2025 Global Threat Report, CrowdStrike reported a 150% increase in China Nexus activity across all sectors from 2024 over 2023. And it's not just Chinese threat actors. I won't steal one of our speakers' thunder, but in this year's Dragos OT cybersecurity report, criminals are already responsible for thousands of attacks on industrial organizations this year, with around 75% of those resulting in some disruption to operations, and around 25% of those attacks resulting in full operation shutdown. And those breaches now trace back to third-party vendors, contractors, software providers, suppliers whose networks and products are interconnected with grid operations. In a world built on digital interdependence, a weak link in one part of the supply chain can ripple across the system. At the same time attacks are up, we're asking more of our grid than ever before. Electricity demand is projected to climb sharply over the next few years. Some estimates suggesting that data centers and AI computing alone would require an additional 100 gigawatts of new peak capacity. We're connecting new renewable resources, building storage, electrifying transport, phasing down legacy generation. All of that progress is vital, but each new connection expands the attack surface. Every smart device, inverter, connected substation becomes a strength and a potential point of entry for our threat actors. The energy sector has made real strides. Investments in monitoring, segmentation, information sharing. Leaders are treating cyber as a board-level priority, but the challenge is outpacing the response. Cybersecurity budgets are still competing with reliability, resilience, and new investments, as if these priorities were separate when in reality they are inseparable. Because when a cyber attack takes down part of a grid, it doesn't just disrupt data. It disrupts lives, commerce, and national security. Reliability depends on resilience, and resilience depends on cybersecurity. And that's what today's program is about. Understanding how to balance these pressures, how to modernize regulation so it enables both innovation and protection, and how to build a grid that is not just more capable, but truly secure. So as I begin, I encourage us all to think about cybersecurity as a foundation of every other goal we have for America's energy leadership. Not an afterthought, not a cost center, but the infrastructure that makes all other infrastructure possible. And with that, I'm excited and pleased to introduce our first session, We'll start with a threat briefing from Christine Martz of Dragos, who will walk us through the latest intelligence on the cyber landscape facing the energy sector and what it means for the challenges and opportunities ahead. Thank you.
Give me 1 second to get set up. All right, make sure I got this working. Yep. All right, so thank you so much for inviting me to come speak today. My name is Christine Martz. I'm a principal product advisor for the electric sector at Dragos. But before that, before we really jump in, I'd like to have a better understanding of the audience makeup. Do we have students that are present? Like if you're a student, you want to raise your hand? Okay, perfect. How about asset owner operators? I know there's some in the room. Okay, great. It's just helpful to know your audience when you get started. I'll just emphasize that I have not always worked on the product side of the house. I started out with an asset owner operator. I was there for 10 years. I focused on NERC SIP compliance primarily, first from the perspective of actually performing the actions to do things like grant access and follow security policies and things like that, and eventually managed a NERC SIP compliance program there. And after that, I went to big tech. I worked for AWS for 3 years, leading their US energy and utilities program, really trying to drive the conversation about the security of cloud-based solutions and applications for the electric sector. And then after that, I got to go to the Edison Electric Institute, where I made some friends who are in the audience today, and where I got to focus on those reliability issues for the electric sector, basically on the cybersecurity side of the house. And now at Dragos, I get to take all of that experience and background and build it into setting up our product team to build things that will actually make a meaningful difference for the people who buy our products and solutions. So I'm really excited to be able to put all that experience together, and I emphasize it here for the students in the room, because I think it's easy to look at a particular industry or sector and think just of the asset owner operator, or just as being part of a particular policy angle. But you can use a lot of skill sets to move in a lot of different ways that are still very impactful. So I would encourage you, if you have any interest in the sector, this is a great community to be part of. People are supportive. They're here to be part of that community. Talk to the people that are here in the room, that are around you, that have lots of experience, and start thinking about where your skill set might fit or where your interest might be, because there are lots of opportunities. I will just say that as part of this particular presentation, I'm going to be covering our year in review, which is basically a report that Dragos puts out every year that talks about all of the threats. We've been publishing it since 2017. So the one that I'm going to be talking about is the 2024 report, but it's still very relevant and gives you sort of that perspective of the risks that you're really facing and the trends that you're seeing. And that's supposed to lead into and set you all up for these 2 great panel sessions that are going to come up afterwards, where you're going to be talking about cybersecurity regulations, those competing priorities that were just discussed, and things of that nature. So I'm excited for those sessions as well. Let's jump in. So I mentioned that throughout the year, Dragos identifies threats to operational technology and industrial control systems infrastructure. We conduct services to help defenders mature their program, and we prioritize mitigations for resilient operations. So really, our whole focus is that OT side of the house. We don't focus on IT primarily. There may be some IT overlap with some of the work that we do, but primarily our focus is going to be in that ICS and OT infrastructure. So I want you to have that lens when you're thinking about this particular threat update. There's a whole nother set of risks and threats that you'll deal with on the IT side of the house. This is just one perspective. But the information I'm going to share with you is based on our 8th annual year in review report. There's so much to cover that I'm only going to cover highlights. So this is an excerpt from the report. If you have any interest in following up and finding out more information about the particular threats, there's a slide at the end that includes a link to the report itself, so you can go in and read more detail and information. But for interest of time, that conversation could go on for hours if we went through the entire report. Before we get into it, I also don't want you to be alarmed. The point of me being here is not to scare you about the cybersecurity threats and risks that are out there. It's really to just inform you, help you understand what adversaries are doing, how they are trying to infiltrate networks, how they are basically adapting and learning about those OT environments, and how to work their way in and go unnoticed for long periods of time. There are a few main takeaways from the year in review report. First is that the geopolitical climate is driving increased concern and interests for cybersecurity and industrial and critical infrastructure. That's something that you just heard. The 2027 date is coming up pretty quick. And things like those potential conflicts are of interest, but also ongoing conflicts. Things like the Russia-Ukraine things that are going on. So just think about that from the geopolitical climate and risk. Last year, we also saw an expansion of adversaries' tools and ransomware events that were targeting critical infrastructure. So we're not seeing a reduction in those threats and risks. We're actually seeing an adaptation of adversaries and threats over time. And adversaries are becoming aware of the impact that they can achieve against easy-to-access industrial control systems. And we'll get into what that means in a little while, but really, if you think about like internet-facing devices, things that are directly connected to the internet, they're going for those low-hanging fruit type items, which is not surprising. That's where you would want to start, right? You don't need to create complicated malware or complicated attacks if you know that there are vulnerabilities in existing communications or the way that something's configured by default. So let's jump to the next. So like I said, we at Dragos, we're focused on the threat groups targeting OT and ICS. You'll see this is a timeline that shows threat groups that we've identified since the beginning of this threat report, since it was created. We've seen a consistent increase in threat activity over the years. 2024 wasn't an exception. A cyber attack in OT space, if you think about it, really takes time because they have to basically understand all the network and communications within that OT environment. So that's going to take them a pretty long time to be able to do that reconnaissance work. That is why when we start to see adversaries pop up and what they're doing is trying to basically get in through those internet-facing devices and just live off the land for a very long amount of time to perform that reconnaissance. So pulling down things like your GIS data, your network maps, different things like that, they are living in your network to get information about you and the way that things actually work so that they can come in and manipulate physical processes. So that's the type of threat behavior that we're starting to see more of. In 2024, we added 2 new Dragos threat groups, Bauxite and Graphite, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. I'm also going to give an update on VoltSite. A lot of you might be familiar with that one because of Volt Typhoon. And then we'll talk about Electrum because I'm going to use that as an example to sort of tie us into a regulatory conversation. There are definitely other threat groups. You can see them all on the screen here that we could jump into, but those are probably the ones that are most relevant for the electric and energy sector at the moment. And like I said, you can definitely look through these on your own should you want to dive into that report in detail. So shifting from threat groups to the threats that we're actually seeing. Geopolitical conflicts have definitely intensified the relationship between hacktivism and state objectives. So I wouldn't necessarily fall for the hacktivism hype. It gets a lot of press, it gets a lot of news, and they are dangerous, but they aren't necessarily as skilled as they claim. In 2024, we saw loud hacktivist attacks that were observed coinciding with more skilled threat group activity, which was concealing what was going on. That's really the risk, is that you're going to start to see these hacktivist organizations partnering with these very skilled threat groups that have the ability, they understand how the networks are organized, they understand the threat vectors, they understand the vulnerabilities, and they're connected in with those hacktivist groups to help support them. And they have sort of a symbiotic relationship. On this slide, you're going to see there's CARR is in the middle. So that's the Cyber Army of Russia Reborn. They continue to target critical sectors in the US, but also on this slide, you'll see Graphite, which is one of the new threat groups that I mentioned earlier, as well as Electrum and Camosite, which we'll get into later. Electrum and Camosite tend to work together in tandem. So Camosite is really sort of that technical group that is helping to feed into Electrum and their hacktivist sort of interests. So it's sort of interesting how they're all connected together and how they're all supporting each other and achieving some of those goals. We're also seeing new OT and ICS specific malware adversaries that would have once been unaware of or ignored OT and ICS just because it was viewed as something more difficult. It was not necessarily of interest. But now they're viewing it as an effective attack vector to achieve disruption and kind of get the attention that they want. right? If you disrupt a manufacturing process, if you disrupt the electric grid, if you prevent somebody from receiving, their electric service at their home, that's really going to drive interest and get their message across. It's going to make the news. It's going to be a headline. It's going to get them that hacktivism attention that they're really looking for. That doesn't necessarily indicate a deeper technical understanding of OT, but it does reflect a more widespread recognition of its utility in achieving their goals. So there's more interest there and more attention being paid to it because it helps to drive their messaging. For ransomware operators, so if we take this to like a real threat scenario, if you're a ransomware operator, this might mean targeting manufacturing environments where downtime directly pressures victims to pay the ransom, right? If you're a manufacturing organization and you're reliant on your manufacturing processes in some way, shape, or form, you might be more likely to pay that ransom rather than wait it out or find an alternative strategy for recovery. For hacktivists, targeting OT offers that fast and disruptive way to amplify their message, like I mentioned earlier. And then these attacks kind of reinforce that crucial reality that sophistication isn't necessarily necessary to achieve those impactful outcomes. So the fact that we have adversaries out there that are sort of recognizing that OT is a way to get that message out faster means that we're going to start to see more of them. So that's part of the risk too, is that once people realize how disruptive this can actually be, you're going to start to see people copycat or build or develop or come up that are looking to do very similar things. In 2024, there were a couple of new OT and ICS specific malwares, the 8th and 9th known, which are up on the screen. Foxnet was deployed against Moscow's municipal sensor gateways, which rendered them inoperable. So basically, it exploits default credentials and poor access controls. So that's kind of a reminder to us that those basic cyber hygiene type items that sometimes we write off as being so basic that, of course, they're being done. Those are the types of areas that people are really honing in on in OT space. Perhaps you don't have that basic cyber hygiene in certain parts of your environment, and that's the way that the adversary might get in. Frosty Goop was an attack on the energy supply for direct heating systems in Ukraine, leading to heating outages for over 600 apartment buildings during sub-zero temperatures. This one is interesting and sort of worrying because it uses Modbus TCP for direct interaction with ICS devices. And for everybody in the room who's like, what is Modbus TCP? It is a protocol that is generally trusted in OT environments, and it's not always regularly monitored. So if somebody were to have knowledge about that particular protocol and how it's used and the fact that it's not being monitored, they might be able to manipulate it in some way to be able to take actions that you didn't want them to take, and they might go undiscovered for quite a long period of time. When we talk about ransomware, this slide might look unalarming to the electric sector folks in the room because there are only 30 ransomware attacks listed on the slide, and I'm sure that you all sort of zoned in on that right away. Remember that the scope of this is OT specific, and these are actual events that occurred. So these are confirmed events where there was a response that was required. That doesn't mean that these are the only instances where a ransomware attack was attempted. So these numbers, they are alarming because they continue to increase year over year. Manufacturing has been at the top for the last couple of years at least for the targeted sectors for this, but still ransomware is still very important for the energy sector and the electric sector overall. So not something to write off. You definitely want to make sure that you are paying attention to any sort of ransomware events that are indicated for the sector. We're going to jump back to those new threat groups that I talked about earlier. So Bauxite is capable of stage 2 of the ICS cyber kill chain and has demonstrated the ability to modify ladder logic in PLCs, so programmable logic controllers, and deploy custom backdoors into ICS equipment. So that gives them a little bit higher of a level of sophistication over some of the other hacktivist activity that we've seen. The attacks generally cause a denial of service to the system, so it's very noticeable. So this is an event where if they were to go after a particular target, that you would definitely see the impact right away. Recent attacks have targeted a specific set of firewalls, exposed ICS devices. So again, those exposed internet-connected devices with direct accessibility, and industrial remote access solutions with clear disruptive intentions. The intent is to establish persistent access within ICS environments to manipulate the operational technology. And they basically use brute force to gain unauthorized control over those PLCs and SCADA systems. So they're really going after the fact that you might be using default credentials. They might be, they're using those brute force password-based attacks to get into your system, look like you, and then operate. They're targeting oil and gas, electric, water and wastewater, chemical manufacturing, food and beverage, critical manufacturing, and their focus is global. Generally, they've been primarily observed in like Europe and the Middle East, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a global goal in mind or perspective in mind. And their attack surface is internet-facing OT devices, specifically VPNs, firewalls, and PLCs. So that is a lot of detail about this particular threat actor, but the thing to bring it back to is that theme of they're looking for the low-hanging fruit. They're looking for ways to get into your internet-connected systems. They're looking for ways to leverage cyber hygiene that is missing. So the fact that you might be using those default credentials again, you might not be monitoring for this particular activity. So just something to keep in mind. If we jump to graphite, so graphite is suspected of aligning with broader state-backed geopolitical objectives. Throughout 2024, the group engaged in near constant spear phishing campaigns. So I know the folks in this room at energy companies, y'all are doing a lot on phishing and making sure that people aren't clicking on bad links, those types of things. But this group is particularly exploiting that spear phishing sort of perspective and getting people to click on things, being able to harvest credentials via those clicked links, and things like that. So this one's really an access-based type threat group. And their intent is to conduct espionage operations against critical infrastructure organizations. And what we said about espionage, right? They're looking for information about your systems, how they typically behave, how they communicate, what they look like, the things they rely on. Because once they have that type of information, then they can figure out what their next plan is. So any of that information going to an adversary is risky. So just putting that out there. This one targets oil and gas, defense suppliers, government, logistics, mostly in Eastern Europe, Turkey, the UAE, that kind of area. Move to the Volt site. This is probably the one everybody's waiting for. Moving on to updates of like known threat groups like Volt site. You've probably mostly heard of Volt Typhoon. This one is still a big deal. It's one of the most, it's one of the scariest OT threats out there. And I hate to use the word scary. It's not very technical, but it is a high risk. They are an example of state-sponsored adversaries that target U.S. critical infrastructure. There's some powerful quotes on the screen from former FBI Director Christopher Wray that illustrate this threat pretty well. I think we heard about this in the opening remarks, is that this is a pretty serious issue. I know that utilities have been talking about this since the news broke about it. It's been a topic of interest. This group is one of those ones that exfiltrates GIS data, OT network diagrams, ICS operating instructions, and that type of information could be used to design future attacks. VoltSite was initially reported by CISA and by Microsoft as Volt Typhoon in May of 2023. So again, this one's been around for a while. Used to perform reconnaissance and enumeration of multiple US-based electric utilities or electric companies, but it also impacts other industries. So this isn't electric sector specific. It also targets things like cybersecurity research, technology, the defense industrial base, banking, satellite services, telecommunications, and educational organizations. So it's just something to keep in mind. It's not electric specific, even though the electric sector has taken it very seriously and has spent a lot of time investigating how they might be able to mitigate those particular threats. It is more broadly impactful. This group relies heavily off of living off the land techniques, and we'll talk about those a little bit more later in the presentation. But really, they're using native tools and commands and controls to compromise systems. So that paired with some slow and steady reconnaissance, it enables them to kind of evade any controls that you might have in place for monitoring. They look like you, they're acting like you, and they're doing it quietly in your network. They have capabilities for stage 1 of the ICS cyber kill chain. Their behavior suggests objectives of espionage and information gathering, like we talked about before. And again, it can just be used for follow-on activities. So it's really the thing that makes them one of the riskier groups, or one of the ones that gets talked about the most, I think, is just their ability to go fly under the radar within the networks and not be detected. And I'm going to move to Camosite and Electrum. So this is the one that I talked about where there's that relationship where they're supporting each other. Camosite serves as an initial access provider for OT targeting groups, including Electrum. Their shift toward targeting third-party vendors presents new risks for ICS supply chains. So this is a supply chain related concern, which is a little bit different than some of the other ones that we've talked about. Electrum is a long-standing OT threat group, and it was actually the first group tracked by Dragos. So if you looked at the screen at the beginning of the presentation where I had all the threat groups lined up, that was the first one that Dragos started tracking. So they've been around for a long time. They typically target energy and telecom, and their geographic focus has been Ukraine and Poland. Their attack surface is things like VPNs, routers, ICS-aware malware, and what their intent is to disrupt critical communication infrastructure. They use ICS-aware malware to manipulate industrial control systems and enable persistent access to follow-on attacks. If you're looking for like key campaigns and things that you may have heard about in the news related to these, maybe the Kyivstar telecom attack in March of 2024 might be something that rings a bell. But there's also the energy grid disruption campaign that manipulated OT systems in Poland using ICS malware. So just things to keep in mind. Now, there are mitigations for these types of threat actors, right? We're talking about threat actors that use malware within ICS environments. If we talk about mitigation, you could deploy OT-specific threat detection tools. You could do things like segment your ICS from IT networks to limit malware spread. You could secure VPN access with multi-factor authentication, implement some strict logging controls, monitor router configurations for unauthorized changes. And because we're going to get into like a regulatory conversation a little bit and an example, I'll just say that if you're thinking about this from a US electric sector specific perspective, those last three things, segmenting your network, deploying logging, secure VPN, multi-factor authentication, and monitoring your router configurations for unauthorized changes, all of those exist as controls within the NERC CIP standards framework. And deploying OT-specific threat detection tools actually does too in the future, because there's a new set of requirements for CIP 15, which is internal network security monitoring. So we have things in place. We have cyber regulations that are driving people to make investments in security controls that would help to reduce the risks associated with some of these threat groups. So just like something to keep in mind is that we're not all just exposed to everything that's out there. There are some things that people are already doing to reduce this risk. All right. Living off the land. So I mentioned we were going to come back to this. I just mentioned that VoltSite and Electrum's reliance on living off the land is something that they really, that's like their bread and butter, right? They're living off the land. Living off the land strategies include using native administrative tools to conceal malicious activities and remain undetected for a long period of time. So they are trying, again, to look like you, to act like you, so that they can get the information that they want undetected, perhaps leave your network for a period of time, take that information, and figure out what next steps might look like in terms of an attack. Basically, they know enough about your system and its behaviors to look and act like a normal native behavior. The goal is to get into your ICS environment and then go unnoticed. They just want all that information so that they can come back later and disrupt, or provide it to somebody else who can disrupt. We just spent a lot of time talking about threats and risks and attacks, and I told you I was going to come back to sort of a regulatory example, and I mentioned internal network security monitoring. I just wanted to bring this back to the fact that we're talking a lot about threats, but there are ways to make sure that the community is aware of what threats are out there, and to make sure that they are implementing a baseline set of cybersecurity controls to help bring them up to a level of security that you can depend on your neighbor having deployed. And some of that is done through regulation, right? You as a utility organization or a utility organization that has to comply with a certain set of standards, you have an expectation that your neighbor's doing that too. And so that helps to build a more resilient grid because you have a playbook to go from, right? You know what controls have to be implemented and how they have to be maintained. And typically, especially with things like the NERC SIP standards, which are a federal level, there are more sets of regulations, state level, all sorts. But this example in particular is federal level. You sort of know that you are addressing a particular threat or risk, and so are all of your neighbors. So the other piece of that, though, is information sharing. And I think we talked about this at the beginning, too. This sector in particular has been very good at information sharing about cybersecurity risks, sharing best practices, not waiting for the regulation to be in place or approved before they take action and make investments in cybersecurity. So that is something they kind of work in tandem. You can't just wait for regulation to come in and tell you what you have to do. You want to be part of that conversation, and you also want to share the information so that everybody understands what that risk and threat is and can agree on how to prioritize it in terms of regulation. So, so for those of you who don't know about SIP 15, this is something that was recently approved by FERC. So I think in June of this year, they approved SIP 15-1, which is the first version of this. It requires internal network security monitoring, which is looking at east-west traffic. And it was really driven originally, because this kicked off in the FERC NOPR was issued in 2022, but it was really based on some of the risks that were identified through SolarWinds in 2020, where they were sort of acknowledging the fact that you could get into a trusted network like an ESP or electronic security perimeter, and that once you were inside, all of those communications were trusted. This is meant to help identify some of those threat actors that we talked about earlier who are living off the land, right? It's looking at east-west traffic to identify what behavior may not actually be normal in your environment. Is there an adversary within your environment who is trying to communicate from a device to another using a protocol that you would never use? Is there somebody that is performing behaviors, or is there a particular communication or connection that's taking place during an hour that you wouldn't expect it to, using an account that you wouldn't expect it to? Those types of things would be captured by an internal network security monitoring tool. And so having said that this started back in 2022, we are finally to a place where we have that approved standard. And actually, if you think about it, the 3-year period that took isn't all that long, because you have to bring industry along to understand, come to a conclusion, develop a standard that brings the playing field up to a level that everybody can participate in, everyone can meet. You have to come up with enforceable dates. The people have to make investments in those tools. They have to train their teams. They have to do all these things. So I would just sort of emphasize that. We can also take it to an actual real life example. So this is the Electrum attack path. So you can, oh, sorry. Just kidding. This one's the Electrum attack path. So you can see how it bypassed traditional perimeter controls where they might exist, and that without tools deployed within that perimeter, you wouldn't necessarily be able to identify that something malicious was happening, or that that the malware was trying to execute within an environment. So just something to be aware of. This is a real life use case. It's not just SolarWinds. It's also all those other living off the land attacks that we talked about that this internal network security monitoring will help support. And this is just a slide on the implementation timeline. So I talked a little bit about this. This slide, I'm not going to go over it in detail. It's just meant to show the regulatory timeline. This only starts from the 2025 approval date of the standard. But remember, we talked about the fact that the NOPR went all the way back to 2022. And so we're talking about a timeline that might span 8 years before the final implementation completes. But again, if you think about the incremental progress over time, the fact that we have people that are making these investments, I know from my role at Dragos that people have already made investments in tools to do this work well before these compliance timelines, well before they ever needed to. So we're not talking about internal network security monitoring or investments in security tools as beginning when a regulation is approved. We're talking about solidifying them and making sure that there's a baseline for everyone to follow once they are approved. So And I guess I would just end on the fact that you can use compliance as a catalyst for improving your security outcomes. So if you weren't thinking about those things, which there might be some folks that just don't have the bandwidth, they don't have the resources, they don't have the abilities to invest in those things early, that compliance can be a catalyst for improving a security program, improving security posture. And so that's always an option. And this is, as promised, the link to the year report, so the actual report that you can see all of the information that we just talked about, plus a whole lot more. And if you want access to the slides, I have no problem with them being shared afterwards. So happy to share those. Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
All right, great.
Yeah.
There's a microphone right here.
Yes, there is.
For our folks online. Anybody have any questions? There we go. All right.
Hello, my name is Eslem. Hi.
Hi.
I work as a QA engineer at a company called Centene. I also study in computer science at NYU. I actually wonder your approach on AI at Dragos. What kind of, how do you use AI to improve your systems or resolve the issue you're having in the past? And how do you, use basically utilize these tools?
How when we're talking about like the Dragos product, like our Dragos platform, so we are working on including an AI components of the Dragos platform today. I might not be the best person to answer exactly how we're using it, just because it's a fairly new initiative where we're trying to consider what the best use cases are for our customers and how to really implement that well. But it's a great question. I'd be more than happy to follow up too. I'm not sure that I have the perspective on the full roadmap for those AI use cases. But we are considering it is something that's part of our product roadmap. And really I think the primary focus of it is helping our SOC analysts or our customers who have our SOC analysts and being able to ingest the security threat information and notifications that they're getting in a much easier way to understand. And what potential actions they may want to take based on those notifications. So, yeah.
I just want to add this. The company that I'm working with, it's a big insurance company.
Sure.
And they are having some issues protecting their data from this kind of malwares because it's a big company.
Mm-hmm.
And they just start utilize AI and similar system to protect their data, which has interested me.
Oh, that is interesting.
That's why I just want to, ask you how you approach with the
Sure.
AI.
Sure.
Thank you for
I
answering.
appreciate it.
Other questions?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Liz. I'm a student at George Washington. I had a question. There's a lot of folks, obviously, that depend on a strong electrical grid. So would it help if more industries also looked at their dependencies on the electrical grid and how they protect their own infrastructure as a way to just reinforce the security? Because I think regulation of other industries doesn't look at that aspect as much.
Do you mean the interdependencies between like other critical infrastructure sectors like water and oil and gas and things?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I think some of that work does happen. There are coordinating groups that do lead discussions on that. We've got some folks in the room who might be experts on that. We want to have a more detailed conversation on it. But I know some of those conversations do happen, and there are exercises that are focused on identifying that overlap and those dependencies. So there's work in that space. And I think that there is a recognition that it does take, not necessarily regulation across all the sectors, but at least acknowledgement of those dependencies and the security risks and threats that impact all of them, which you'll notice so I spent a lot of time focused on electric sector specific things in the presentation just because of the audience and the topic today. But Dragos looks at operational technology and ICS in general. And so there's a lot more information in this report that's about things like manufacturing, oil and gas, water and wastewater, all those other groups, because a lot of those threats do span across all the different critical infrastructure sectors.
Anybody else in the room?
Hi, I'm Anthony. I work at a startup called Anandir Horizon. We do geopolitical risk. But I just have a question about how things, because you map the criminal groups and then the state-sponsored groups. I wonder, is there coordination the way you see sometimes kinetically in the case of Russia? Like in Crimea, they use criminal gangs to support the military. Do you see that concordance between the criminal and the state-sponsored groups?
Ooh, I don't know that I have a great answer for that question. It is a great question. I'd have to do a little bit more digging and research with our threat intel team to get you like a really fact-based answer. I would say that if you'd have to dig into each of the state-sponsored threat actors to figure out those different coordination paths. I showed the one example of the Cyber Army of Russia Reborn with all their connected groups. Some of them are hacktivism related, so you can guess that they're driving interests for the primary party that they support. But so you could tangentially, you could sort of relate some of them, but I'm not sure that I have a great answer across the board. So that's something I could follow up on.
All right, we have one online. One generally held belief is that OT owners put a lot of onus on rigorous certifications for safety. Can you talk about how the OT mindset interacts with cybersecurity hardening implementations, which are requiring changing in internal systems?
Yeah, so I guess is the question more focused on the fact that the emphasis for a very long time has been on safety, like physical safety of the operators of those OT systems and the processes that are supported by those OT systems, and now we're shifting into that cybersecurity lane a little bit more.
Right, and the certifications that would underpin that general safety, both of the I assume of the OT systems themselves as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that if we're talking about the fact that there has been this strong emphasis for a very long time on safety as associated with operational technology because of the functions those assets perform, there's a recognition that those certifications are important. Certainly safety isn't any less important than it has been previously, but these new threat actors, the way that they are operating and trying to infiltrate OT systems kind of takes advantage of the fact that we've paid a lot of attention to the function of the asset, but maybe not necessarily the security of those protocols and things. So I think there's more work to be done when we talk about the security of the OT assets themselves, and maybe more of the secure architecture of those OT type solutions and building in ways to either supplement the way that they work today. So maybe we don't need to change the OT system itself. Maybe we need to supplement with additional security controls and things like that. But I think that there certainly is a shift in mindset. There certainly is this need to sort of dive into how we secure these systems that are primarily meant to serve an operational purpose, and that they need to include safety.
All right, oh, we got one more.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm from Columbia Law School. Thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. I just wanted to ask one question regarding the new regulation you talked about, the CIP 015.
Yeah.
I was a little surprised to hear that I forgot what exactly you said, but you were kind of glad or happy to see the regulation come in place.
So the thing that I'll say is that I am a compliance nerd. So it may have just come across that way because I personally have been involved in the NERC-CIP regulatory process for a pretty long time. I would say NERC-CIP is a unique framework in the United States where industry gets to actually develop the standards. So FERC put out a NOPR, they put out an order and a directive that said, this is the security risk we're seeing, and this is how we think it needs to be addressed. But they don't necessarily give you the how. And then industry takes that, works with NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, and they develop the standard. And it goes out for industry valid. So it's an iterative process along the way. So you've got industry representatives who are writing the standard, and then you also have all of industry getting to vote on that standard. So it kind of helps to ensure that the standards meet the security objectives, they meet what the regulator's asking for, but that they're also implementable when they are issued. And so that's kind of why I get excited about it, is because that's pretty unique in terms of a regulatory framework when you think about the way that most cybersecurity regulations are delivered. So
Makes
that's why
sense.
I was excited about it.
Yeah, usually with more compliance requirements and regulation, I was on the practical implementation side.
Yeah.
We didn't really like additional requirements coming in. So
Yeah, this
that's why I
one
was surprised, but makes sense.
this one in particular is also it's one of the only, well, I mean, I wouldn't say only, it's probably not fair to say, but it's one of the most recent examples of a risk-based standard. So industry really gets to take this risk-based approach in figuring out how they want to implement the controls. And it's something that FERC as the regulator and NERC were both very supportive of. And so that gives a lot more flexibility to industry to say, hey, this threat exists in your environment. This is the risk you're mitigating. Now go set up a justification, go figure out how you're going to implement and manage that implementation.
Sorry, one last thing. So it's very, this is very unique to the electric grid environment, or?
Yes,
I
yes,
see.
it's very unique. I would say even if you look at some of the combo companies and things that have to manage compliance with things like TSA, the TSA security directives or others, that those are typically driven by the regulator and pushed down as a regulatory framework. This is a much more collaborative industry process, and I'm not sure that there's any other framework that's like it in the U.S.
Thank you.
So it's pretty unique.
And one more question. Getting my steps in today.
Awesome briefing. So year in review, what's over the horizon? What keeps you up at night? Are these AI tools that are being readily available for all these threat actors going to present an even bigger challenge?
I wish I had a fully baked answer to this question because it's a really important question. I will say that we have excellent threat hunters and a great team that is focused on developing the year-end report, and they do it all year long. But as far as the threats and risks, I think what we're starting to see is that increase in interest. So I can tell you that there's an increase in interest in specific OT malware and things. And so that concerns me, keeps me up at night, that they are really driving towards creating these things that are unique to OT space. The fact that we're talking more about living off the land, and that really these adversaries could be going undetected and unnoticed. So, I mean, I don't see the threat landscape slowing down anytime soon, but I'm not sure. I don't know if I have a good answer about the AI component and how we're going to see that reflected in the year-end review report this year. So we'll probably get a little more insight into that in a few months.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Angela, and I'm with the UN. I'm interning there at the DCO. And my question is, with your report for your strategic recommendations, do you have any when it comes to cyber resilience and continuing or service continuity with a degraded state?
I would say that when we're talking about ways to improve your own security programs as an individual organization, that part of that is ensuring that you have the tools for visibility into those OT environments. And you have to have visibility of the things that you want to protect. So investing in tools, processes, programs that will give you that visibility are really important. And then when you talk about incident response and in those crisis type situations where you're going to need people to understand how the system operates, that's something that you should be emphasizing. Training, exercises. You can even do that with third parties. Dragos offers services where we'll come in and we'll help you test the cybersecurity program that you have today, your incident response approach, and then provide recommendations for how you might be able to improve it, different groups that you might want to train, things like that. But when you talk about resilience is also not waiting until the crisis to flex the muscle, right? Because if you wait till then, you probably aren't going to be in a good position to be able to address that issue pretty quickly. So I would say a lot of the emphasis is on training, having tools for visibility, and exercising your plan regularly.
Any final questions? We're about ready to get to our first panel, so just...
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine, for that informative presentation. I was taking so many notes. I felt like I was in grad school again, which is really exciting for me. Next up, we have our first panel, and it is my pleasure to introduce Jeff Baumgartner, Rich Ward, and Michelle Guido. The floor is yours.
Check, check. I think I'm good. You guys can hear me? Yeah.
1, 2, check.
1, 2, check. There we go. Hi, good morning. Michelle Guido, Southern Company. I am the Strategic Security Policy Director. I've been at Southern Company for 21 years. Prior to that, I was also in communications as well as technology organizations, and I started my career recovering mainframe computers a long time ago. So as my role in Southern Company for the last 15 years is national security strategy, partnerships, programs, and policies. So it's working collectively across our organization to set up what we're talking about today. So it's not just for cyber, but it's for grid operations, and it's for keeping the lights on, and for everything that you look to and to use. So natural disasters is part of this, as well as cyber. So if we need to get into that, we can as well. And a lot of my focus is external. So it's working across the industry and working with the two gentlemen up here on the stage for many years. Also working with Kristen, Caitlin, so many of you here in the room that I've worked with. But for that, it's the industry collectively, and then also we work cross-sector. And I see JP Morgan here. So we talk about interdependencies and getting to that unified voice of what we could have from a resilience plan, because we are so interconnected. There are no islands, and we're so dependent on each other. So I have a vast portfolio, but now I'll turn it over to Rich to introduce himself, and we look forward to your questions and our conversation.
Thanks, Michelle. Well, thank you all. It's great to be here. Just a little bit about my background, a little more of a political and policy background. I've worked at the White House. I've worked on the Hill. Also, at Edison Electric Institute alumni. Worked almost 11 years there and joined Venable just a little over 2 years ago. I'm in our government affairs and legislative practice. But I've also worked on a number of many of the things that we've been talking about today, and I touched a lot of different departments at EEI, from communications to our national security group, to working on these issues in front of Congress from a legislative and policy point of view. So I've spent my career so far sort of straddling the line between what the operators have to really worry about, what are the authorities and capabilities they need to do their job, and how we can then sort of communicate that out to Congress or to administrations and folks that work in the administration that obviously rotate a lot through every year, and you have folks rotating in and out of industry as well. So trying to maintain a constant message of unity of effort is critically important. And so I've worked and known Michelle and Jeff for a long time. I think I've been talking about grid security since 2013, but we take a holistic approach to this, and I'm very proud of what the electric sector has done in the time going all the way back to even Superstorm Sandy and some of the threats we've seen, particularly as the geopolitics change. And so vigilance is critically important. And so, Jeff, why don't you go ahead?
Hi, good morning. My name's Jeff Baumgartner. I'm the Senior Vice President and Chief Security Officer at Berkshire Hathaway Energy. For those of you unfamiliar with our footprint, We have customers and infrastructure in about 35 US states. We're in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia as well. It's my job to make sure that we have a unified security approach across all that footprint. And before that, I worked at Department of Energy for 12 years in a variety of emergency response and policy development roles. And I started my career in nuclear generation, actually. So happy to be here, happy to work with these two. You should have fun today. Ask us a lot of questions. We're pretty straight shooters.
Yeah. So we came up based off of what the institution, SIPA, do you say SIPA? SIPA? SIPA and Venable. So it's supposed to be an update on cyber regulation and the grid, but there's so many components of all of this, so we want to make sure that we hit it. So we have a framework, and we're going to start off with cyber readiness amid electrification. So I'm going to kind of navigate our conversation today, but know that if you have a question, just raise your hand, because they're definitely different sections that we're going to be talking about. So cyber security regulation for the grid is evolving fast, with demand surging, threats intensifying, and authorities overlapping. How do we streamline compliance while actually improving security and resilience? So let's begin there with where that strain is the greatest in meeting this new energy demand. Jeff, why don't you start?
Yeah, I mean, I think the drivers in the growing demand are creating additional complexities to the regulatory environment that we have to operate in. So Christine mentioned a lot of the federal regulation that we have to be compliant with at NERC, but each one of the states that we are in also have a regulatory framework that we have to be compliant with and auditable, right? So there are two distinct mechanisms that keep us honest with our customers, and those mechanisms started as a reliability issue, not a security issue. And so this kind of layered complexity adds to the lack of speed for regulation catching up to security threats. But particularly when we talk about demand, it creates hurdles for us when trying to meet the new demand from customers around, like, say, AI. You know, we have data centers now that are requiring the same amount of energy as Manhattan. One data center. That's nuts. You know, when we're talking about a 7 gigawatt data center, I'm not sure the average person really understands how big that is, but that is Manhattan on any given day. And that type of speed, you know, I think ICF just produced a report looking at demand for generation growth, and they suggested to meet the AI demands, we needed 80 gigawatts a year. The industry as a whole in the US is on target for about 65 gigawatts. That gap exposes us to additional risk from an AI national security perspective. And I think, Rich, I think we've talked about this a lot, and some of those drivers around the demand and what AI does for national security, but how if we're not meeting that electrification, you know, what are our risks as a country?
Well, and I think just to set the stage a little bit, 11 years at EEI, I didn't talk about growing energy demand once. And now we're talking about it in exponential amounts. So the industry has had to pivot extremely quickly to adjust for this new future. And so how that's done, and so you have to meet the demand. You don't the industry does not want to be in the way of this growth from tech and how we're all getting so used to these.
I mean, frankly, that's how we make money, right?
Right.
So, if I sell more power, that's great for me.
And conversely, if you're not spinning, right, that's a problem too. And so, and I think the total industry is like 1,200 megawatts across the country. So you think about gigawatts, sorry. You think about where we need to get to and to meet those gaps, it's a real risk. You look at how, you're talking about this from a national security standpoint, these large loads are going onto the distribution grid, and historically, the NERC SIP and the NERC FERC regulatory is only focused at the bulk power, and that's because we have always realized that that's where the real significant impacts to the country could be. But now you introduce large load on the distribution level, and our state regulations and the understanding of that when we were talking about reliability and affordability being the number 1 and 2 priorities at the state level, that's a real challenge. And so do we have to look at large load differently? Because this new risk, if you were to link large load, if you were to take a lot of data centers offline at once, that dramatically changes the equation for grid operators when they're balancing the grid. And so how is there certainty that that can't happen? And what are the plans in the event that it does? And it's data centers, it's crypto mining, it's trying to onshore all this new domestic manufacturing that we've allowed to go overseas that we want to see onshored again. And all these things have to be factored into how we operate the grid, the cost to the customer, and reliability. And all these large loads are being asked to run at 100% 24/7. So presents a real challenge. And it does all underpin national security because our entire government, every agency, every other critical sector relies on commercial power.
Well, and all those issues that you identified, are those state issues or are those federal issues? And I think that's still up for debate. And I think both entities are trying to solve for that. And that creates complexities and uncertainty for me and how to address that issue and how I can make those investments. And I think we had a question over here earlier about why federal regulation helps us. So from a federal regulatory perspective, SIP 15 requires me to monitor my operational environments. Well, the way that I get that cost addressed is through state mechanisms. So I have to go to every state that I'm in and say, this is going to be my budget. This is what I want to charge customers in this state. And this is my guaranteed rate of return. And I have to get that approved at the state level. If I have a federal mechanism that says this is the best security practice, then that helps me at that state level to get that cost accounted for in our rates at the state.
Yeah. So energy security is national security. We've heard that for many years. And when I'm looking at it with everything that they're saying, so with this administration, we're talking energy dominance, and there's a new business model, which they've just explained. But then you go out and you're talking within the communities, and there's critical infrastructure that you need to build these data centers, like water, and we need telecommunications. So when we go out and we're talking about security, we have to look at the whole landscape and everything that's as part of the ecosystem. And that happens within our companies as well. So I think one of the things that we've come to as in the last couple of years is national security, the geopolitical risks. We're talking about that in our companies with supply chain. Not only with your compliance to meet a standard, but how we operate and how we plan ahead. So, for example, even with certain tariffs that are out there right now, our supply chains and what we're looking for, whether it's for a natural disaster, and we need, lumber from Canada, timber, for our poles because of a hurricane or a tornado, or just new growth in an area, or anything that we would need could be impacted by a tariff or an executive order. So I think what you're seeing from understanding risk, it's not just in the vertical anymore. It's not just at distribution. It's not just at transmission and generation. You're seeing it in the services. So when you talk cyber, and this month is National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, besides maybe your corporations doing phishing, going out and doing email to see if you could click on something, they're actually having companies like Dragos come in. We're exercising with states. The Alabama Power Company is exercising with the Alabama State CIO, and we're actually doing a cyber event. So it's uniquely different than when I joined years ago, and it was more on natural disasters. And so what I like to talk about is cause and effect. So there's risk, and within our corporations, all of us are working on it, not just within IT and OT, but we're really trying to understand what the risks are. And so you have cause, which could be a natural disaster, or it could be a cyber event like ransomware or an attack of some sort. But then you have the effect. And the effect translates across the industry, up to leadership, up to your board of directors, and out into your community that you serve, as well as all your critical infrastructure that's in that circle that is getting power from you. So that could be businesses, schools, hospitals, and it just transcends into a different level of conversation. So you're really trying to make decisions and be proactive in understanding what power and keeping the lights on looks like today and into the future with this new energy demand. So a lot of the programs that I'm working on are like the bigger picture programs, but working with people like Rich and Jeff and Kristen and formerly Caitlin and Kate Mabbitt and Des from JP Morgan. We're all in this together, and the risk is a conversation to move it to, resilience, robust, adaptable, timely, action-oriented, and having the conversation, and really, when you exercise, trying to break things. Not to have a success. You want to break it.
Yeah, I think I would just add, because Kristen talked a little bit about how the industry doesn't wait to be compliant with the standards. I mean, obviously it can't afford to. I mean, 8 years to go from, or even earlier because of once the threat's identified, to a NOPR, to the way the industry works with the regulators to pass it and then to actually implement it. That's just one leg of the stool. The other part, as we've talked a little bit about, is working with government. The power sector is unique in the sense that because it's really sort of geographic in its work with across the country, it's not as competitive. So it has the ability to work amongst each other and with the government. And because it's mainly domestic, we have a lot more CEO engagement that actually works with the government on these issues. And then the last piece is, that Michelle just touched on, is resilience. Everything has to be about making sure a bad day doesn't become a catastrophic one. We have to assume something is going to go boom in the night. The sector has a defense in depth posture. When you're seeing living off the land type threats, we have to assume that they're on the inside. We learned this going all the way back to 2015 with the first cyber attack in Ukraine that took out the grid. Russians were in the Ukrainian grid for 6 months. They were able to get super credentials and those types of things. We have to assume that and plan from the inside out. And so what you're seeing with the new SIP regulations is stuff that the industry's already been thinking about. It's just that when you have over 3,000 utilities, you got to have a way to have the tide lift all boats. And we do have a big dichotomy of large, well-resourced investor-owned electric companies all the way down to municipals that oversee within a city footprint to cooperatives. They're now facing their own challenges because that's where a lot of data centers and large load want to go. And so the sector has to look at this holistically, but you can't just rely on the regulations because those are just trying to identify and protect against risks we've already know. And so what we're looking forward to, we have to be factoring in working with government, even in some international. I know you've done some international work, and you have stuff internationally, and then that resilience component, because we have to be able to get the lights back on, and other sectors working with us to do that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we definitely look beyond regulation. You know, we leverage certification, we look at NIST cybersecurity framework, and those maturity models and that certification process allows us to understand how we might be able to grow and maintain ahead of some of those threats. But I still think that there's a real need for adjudicating kind of this state-federal question on who has the responsibility to create these mechanisms for regulatory compliance and authority. I think
what about
until
national defense, where would you say? Like, so are you going to put it up at the federal level?
I mean, you know my response. I think that there are a lot of great reasons to look at these issues as a federal issue because they don't care about a state border, right? And so I have infrastructure that connects between states. If I have to be compliant in one state but not compliant in the other state, yet the rate case for charging those customers is the same rate case, how do I then explain that to customers on the other side of an artificial border that, well, this state wanted that. You know, this state wanted this level of protection while you were fine with this level of protection.
And gas is, if you're a combo, is treated differently.
Yeah, I mean, we have
certainly trying to get more aligned post-colonial pipeline, but
yeah, we have tens of thousands of miles of pipeline, and those electric regulations don't account for that. Christine noted it, but that's a TSA security directive issue, right?
But if you have certain things you have to comply with on the electric side, are you doing it across your whole enterprise?
Yeah. And some of that is, efficiencies that we can gain because, making the investment for 80% of our infrastructure versus 100% additional cost is a marginal upgrade, right? And so there are some benefits to how we're structured and how we operate, but I don't think that that's universal across companies or types of electric utilities.
So 85% of critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector. What have you seen change in the last years? The discussion, is it customers aware that it's, you can't, during a storm, it may be days. Is it we're so dependent on electricity that we need to have a different level of conversation, public-private, at all these different levels, federal, state, local, tribal?
Well, I don't think the sector can wait on the government. I don't think your strategy can be that the government's going to come and bail you out and help you. They're going to be your partner, but they don't understand your systems necessarily. And so you have to take matters into your own hands. You're going to need them, and they're going to be able to provide support. But there's no white knight coming in to save you. And the sooner you realize that and build and plan for that. But it's a really complex environment that the power sector has to operate in, and we have to maintain affordability for folks. And so that balance, and you have all these different jurisdictional turf wars, to solve the state federal, I don't know how that gets done. We're certainly not going to solve that today. We've always talked about
one of these students.
That's right. That's the
There you go.
future.
Somebody ready?
There is a gray area there, and it's growing and growing because of the dynamic nature of what the growing energy demand is gonna push onto this industry that, for the most part, likes and has operated in the background. And so now, I think there's a real conversation because the technology companies that are pushing this, they have a tremendous amount of resources. But they don't want to be grid operators, but they also know that they need their products and services require this infrastructure and requires the power. And so there's a lot of conversations going on between those folks now, which has not traditionally been a sector that we've been cross-sector interdependent conversations with. So it's a much newer conversation. And so they're waking up to the realization, and now they have to sort of understand within this current regulatory framework how they can achieve their objectives.
And I think what the conversation has evolved even over the last 5 years is kind of more recognition among the private sector that there's a lot we can do on our own, and really developing those relationships, not just within our sector, but across sectors, enables us to gain that visibility that we might have been missing. We all look at risk differently. We are a very risk-averse company. We treat risk as something that we have to manage and have to mitigate from hundreds of angles, right? That's us. That's not everybody. And so how do we kind of enable our approach to coordinate and work with others? And I think that's the conversation that we're having today is we all operate differently. We all have different enterprise size and scale and capabilities. And how do you kind of normalize some of that to recognize risk across sectors and across ways that we're measuring it and managing it? And I think that is the conversation that we've been having. It's definitely evolved over the last 5 years, but specifically over the last 2, I think we're trying to get to that, I manage it using A, you manage it using Z. How do we normalize that and learn from it and implement either a prevention, a mitigation, a resilient action as a result of that risk?
Yeah, so when we talk about sectors, we're trying to, part of the conversations we've been having in the last couple of years, through a group that we call Tri-Sector, and it's electricity, finance, and communications, is how do we get out of that vertical? So the government looks at us as a vertical, right? So through your sector risk management agency, and electricity is a subsector of energy with gas. But so we have a plan and we have a playbook. But you get to that really bad day. It's 2027, right? You wake up and what's hit the fan. So you're taking in all this information and you've got this playbook, but it stays within the vertical. And it works. So how do you collectively work? And disasters are local. So you got local, then you've got state, then you've got federal. You've got all these vertical cross-sector interdependencies and dependencies. So that part of that, 85% of the critical infrastructure owned and operated by the private sector, we're having those levels of conversation. We're taking it. We own, operate it. We want to mitigate the risk. So either you accept risk or you mitigate it. So we're trying to figure out what does that plan look like for cascading impacts and systemic risk. And it's the horizontal, not the vertical. And then you're going to have multiple players within that from the government. And I think that's one of the things that is that we found is that there is like the National Cyber Incident Response Plan, but private sector isn't really at the table.
Well,
So we want to be, and we've asked, and then you have some of the writings, but then when it happens, who's in charge and who's taking the lead, like what you saw in Colonial Pipeline. You know, I was asked when I first started doing this at Southern Company, who's going to show up at the door? And I said, everyone. And I would say that again, everyone shows up at the door. And from a company who was involved in Salt Typhoon, one of their comments that they've talked back to us and to the government, and they just stated that they were hurting the government because so many people were coming into them as a telecommunications or communications company. And so you had the FBI, you had, you know, all CISA and you know, the White House.
Partners.
Everybody's going like, well, they're meeting, all their resources are trying to bring them up to speed on education and awareness instead of a central point of contact. So one of the things we've talked about, there's a continuity of government plan. We'd like to have a continuity of critical infrastructure plan where we can set priorities and adapt based off of the needs of what's truly happening. So that's definitely something I've seen in the last 2 years.
When
I think that gets to security as well as reliability and resilience. We're talking the whole spectrum.
But I think it's just a recognition of that fragmentation, not just, you know, from federal, state, and local, but also energy, finance, water, telecommunications, right? And the again, kind of going back to how that framing has changed over the last couple of years, the private sector is the one that talks to all of those elements. You know, the government is still talking individually to those parties, but the private sector, you know, partially because we have to make money, partially because we're a business, we have to find a way that it works for all of those parties. And so kind of combining some of the solutions and trying to understand what those gaps are and how we can still run an effective and profitable business while meeting our customers' needs around cost and reliability is just a function of what we have to do.
Yeah, I think when you get into response, if you watch the Weather Channel or anything, and what's the first thing that happens with a hurricane? They tell you how many people without power. We've always said we're going to know it when we see it. You're going to know it because, well, the power will be out, or maybe comms, or you know, which we rely on completely, right? We all do, voice and data. So what does that look like? I don't know if we're going to know it. Living off the land, right? I mean, if they're in the systems like we believe and like the intelligence has told us, what is, you know, how are we adapting to that? And when, you know, again, is it that wake up, you get the call in the middle of the night? Is this what it is? I'm not so sure. Are we going through a process right now? These are the conversations that we need to be having collectively. And another thing too that we're trying to do from critical infrastructure in the private sector is we're trying to get semantics to talk the same. We have so many acronyms within our industries. And then when you go and then you sit across the table and you want to have, you know, how you're approaching something, communications and electricity work very well together because of our mutual assistance in natural disasters. And, you know, so you're going to put down communications lines, you're going to put down, you know, power lines underground or poles and wires. So we've worked together, but then once you go out and you start talking to finance or you're talking to water, they have a different way of approaching things, a different process and how they look at it and how they speak. But sometimes when we go to the government, we're asking for the same thing. So how can we bring that together and have that unified voice? And so it's unity of message as well as unity of effort. You want me to keep going down our list here? Yeah, no.
Yeah, please.
Tell us when you want to open up. Got questions?
Yeah, coming on. Oh, yeah. We're just going to keep talking. This is what we do.
Listen, you just wind me up.
Yeah,
Pull the string, I'm going to keep going.
So we've got a couple coming in online. So if you guys have questions too, based on what you've heard so far, yep, we'll get to you. But I want to ask one follow up to exactly the point you just made, real quick.
Sure.
So critical infrastructure wants to be a point which has a coordination role. Whose responsibility is it? I mean, you've got 3,000 people. You said yourself, you got 3,000 people with various degrees of financial ability.
Mm-hmm.
Is every one of those 3,000 folks responsible for their own coordination plan with the government? Is it done through the two big companies you're kind of represented up here? Like, how does that actually work in practice? In a perfect world.
In a perfect world? Oh, gosh. Well, you always have those who have the resources and the funding and the money should take the lead, right? And sometimes you can't go for consensus. You want to go for the collaboration. So I've always started things with small groups and whiteboard sessions, coming up with something, a straw man, and then going out. And so, if you go out to the smaller companies, you should go out with something because they don't have the number of resources that we would have at a Southern company as an investor-owned utility. So I would say you start with those who can and who are willing, and then pull in the others. That's kind of like what we've done. We do have the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, which is both, all three. It's IOUs, municipals, and cooperatives, and it's 30 CEOs. So starting at the top with that Sector Coordinating Council being CEOs, and that happened after Superstorm Sandy. It really drives when it comes from the top, from the leadership. So you see more people coming to the table and wanting to be a part of something, and it's making sure that you can get it out and include all of it. So, and we'll talk about ETAC, which we set up. It's the Energy Threat Analysis Center. I'll let Jeff talk about that, but that's something that is for security. It's on threats, but we started with 4 IOUs. And now it's 16 companies, and it's growing, and it includes smaller companies as well. So I don't know if it's really I don't think there's a perfect path.
I don't know if there's one way to solve it for every sector. I think for us, we have a strong culture of mutual assistance and a connectivity that a lot of other sectors don't have. I mean, my company alone is connected to hundreds of other utilities because of the way that the grid is operated. And so for us, we think of that responsibility as a way to kind of rising tide raises all boats, or however that goes.
Is that where it goes?
If we can build it and have the differing levels of maturity and resource in mind as we're creating that mechanism, and a way for those other organizations to plug in and find a way to message how they plug in to all of those 3,000. Not everybody has to be involved up front, right? And so there are important considerations in how we're building that. And stakeholder engagement, but just because they're not at the table doesn't mean that they're not part of it. And I think that's a critical piece to building anything in our sector is we have to consider everybody, but not let that cause us to pause and not do it because it's not a perfect solution right away. You can evolve things and you can understand the gaps and talk to those stakeholders to ensure that what we're doing helps the entire sector. I mean, the Energy Threat Analysis Center is a perfect example. We did start with for companies. But the products that we were creating were sent out through the electricity ISAC to the entire membership, right, of the ISAC. Is that all 3,000? No, but that's your choice on whether or not you're part of the ISAC. As long as you were part of the ISAC, you were gaining the benefit of the collaborative work with the government and the subject matter experts that my company devoted to creating that product. We created threat hunt guides and mitigation support for a variety of real threats faster than we ever had before. What a great thing to provide to all of those other companies that have different resources, that have different maturity levels, to be able to walk through and say, step one, step two, step three. And so, through that very actionable piece, I think you can see how we could create something on a response scale that would act and grow in a similar way.
I'm Adam Hastings. I'm a professor of computer science at Fordham. Just a question for the panel. If you have any specific examples where like policy and regulation, like this exogenous force, has like created meaningful improvements to security posture, and then maybe any specific examples if you have of like this policy and regulation being more of a cost than it's worth.
Well, the regulatory harmonization.
We've tried for many years, and it's been identified. First of all, Washington, D.C. loves to do reports and recommendations, and we have more bookshelves of reports and recommendations, and there's a lot of good stuff in there that never sees the light of day. I think one of the things that you were a part of, and I did a little bit with the Solarium Commission, was that they actually put members of Congress on the commission to look at cybersecurity, and that empowered them to try to find a way to get stuff passed through Congress, and it was still really hard. I think it was like 100 recommendations, and they got like 29. So getting stuff passed is extremely difficult. They all put deadlines on stuff, so we've just had expired. The Cyber Information Sharing Act of 2015 has currently expired. Our counter-UAS authorities at the federal level have currently expired with the government shutdown. That was a driving force. They both need to be reauthorized, but there's been a lot of push to expand those authorities, and those have been hotly debated for a long time. Harmonization continues to be one that has been pointed out for years, because we have so many different things that we need to comply with across sectors and across agencies that it's becoming a real challenge. You have the information, the cyber incident reporting legislation that we're still waiting for final rules on. And a lot of this is also underpinned by, are there the necessary protections for companies to share and to work with government? The government is fully indemnified and protected, and they want everything from the private sector, but they can't protect you from that, from lawsuits coming later, or the regulatory, potential regulatory piece to that. And so liability protections has been something that has been hotly debated within Congress as well. Nothing is ever narrow enough, or there's concerns that these companies are doing something wrong, and therefore they are not the victim, and are open to being attacked from a lawsuit standpoint. They're dealing with nation states, and they are a private company. They don't have guns, planes, intelligence gathering, but what they do have is they have these risks and these threats within their companies, and that's why there's that relationship with government. So we have to continue to think about creative ways to move legislation forward. We have this ETAC program. We want to get it codified. We have had a bill for 3 years trying to move it. We are looking at mechanisms for industry and government to work better together. We're trying to work on legislation in that space to not make it so difficult and challenging. And so all these things, if we can get them in place, can make sharing and operational collaboration easier. But every committee on the Hill touches cyber. If you're trying to move something in an energy bill, it has to have sign off from Homeland. If National Defense Authorization passes every year, one member of Congress can stop something that may be slightly out of the jurisdiction of armed services. But we've talked about critical infrastructure underpinning national security, but one member can slow that down. We have to worry about churn in administrations as well. So there's a lot in the space. And Ross, to your question earlier about how this stuff moves forward, there's a lot of individuals in the sector, and there are some on this stage and in this room that could have easily have given up on many of these initiatives, and they never would have seen the light of day. And for an industry that works or has a culture of inside the box, being risk averse, we need rule breakers a little bit. We need people pushing the envelope and showing initiative because the threats are dynamic. And so there's been a big shift, but it's a little scary because there's just a lot of individuals working their tail off to move some of this stuff forward. And if they weren't there, they may not. And that also means what else is out there that didn't happen that could or needs to.
Hi, my name is Oleg Shakirov. I'm a student at Johns Hopkins. I have a more of a general question. So I think it's interesting that when people talk about cybersecurity and in particular threats to critical infrastructure, there is a lot of this national security, like cyber defense talk, and a lot of threats are driven by, it's widely recognized that the threats are driven by geopolitical risks and there are national state threats. But then when it comes to kind of defending, it's ultimately, and I'm simplifying it, but it's ultimately every like privately owned company has to do this by themselves. The government is mostly acting as a regulator, so there is no kind of this collective defense. Something that you see in other areas or in other domains, let's say. So you do not, when it comes to like air domain, you do not expect every like utility company to have their own air defenses, right? So it's kind of accepted that this is delegated to the government. And when it comes to cyber threats, I mean, do you think the government can do more, especially like in the United States? I'm coming from Russia, and I see the same thing in Russia. I'm pretty sure that you can see the same thing in Ukraine. So still, like it's to simplify, cyber is very private. Everyone is talking about these kind of almost warlike threats, but then we do not see this response on par with this rhetoric. So maybe this rhetoric is exaggerated, or maybe it's impossible to kind of to address it. It's impossible for the governments to address this problem kind of collectively as a cyber defense kind of task. So sorry if it's confusing, but
That's a good question. You take it, Jeff.
I mean, I think I think that is one reason why we partnered with the government to stand up the Energy Threat Analysis Center. We do have the responsibility to prevent those actors from getting into our networks, and yet government can play a key role by supporting us with intelligence, with different programmatic elements that enable us to action what they are seeing with their unique visibility at the edges of our network. And so I think we are trying to create that partnership, but there is a reality that I own and am responsible for defending my network. And government's role in that is new. You know, I mean, before cyber, what the intelligence community had to do was support government. That was it, because that was the target. Now that I'm the target, how does that authority and government need to shift to better support the private entities that are now part of the target of nation states? And I think that's one reason why we're here today.
One thing that we did when we were developing ETAC 5 years ago, 6 years ago. We've been working on it for a long time. We stopped just saying information sharing, we started saying information exchange. So you have data, information to knowledge, and working with the government, how they look at the data looks different than how we do as owners and operators, and we're learning through that process. So they're coming to the table because people need power. And we're doing it with DOE, but we're also working with other intelligence agencies. Now, there are conduit, DOE Intel opens the door to the other agencies, which the bureaucracy or the protocol and process that exists within the government can be a little bit much when you're sitting on this side of the house, but we're working through it and we're learning, and you constantly want to be pushing and driving. So we have analysts who are sitting in a room from industry with analysts from the government, and then we pull in our labs as well. So I don't know if this is exactly answering your question, but we can't do it alone, and we shouldn't do it alone. But what that looks like is...
Well, and the you mentioned it, the geopolitics matters, right? Like Ukraine and Russia, the geopolitics changed, right? Everyone's watching China and Taiwan. What are the geopolitics? Here, it's different. We have different geopolitics, but it can change, right? And so it is a deterrence, and we also have to hope and assume that our government can unleash those capabilities on others, and that keeps it at bay. Because once you cross over to life, health, and safety of citizens, that's different than just army on army, right? Than just government on government. And so that's a line that when we see it cross, you can point to geopolitics, and when it's not, there's a deterrence holding that up, and that's something that everyone, and that's a big role that the government has to play to give the private sector a heads up if things are going to shift, because and we've seen that, right? Like shields up, and when stuff changes,
design.
yeah, that that's when we need the government to come in and say, eyes wide open, right, head on a swivel type mindset. So the geopolitics matters.
Coming to Inez, but I'm going to follow up on that real quick. Yeah, I'm a Louisiana boy, lived through Katrina, saw a big change in how response happened. What's the most useful thing to date that you guys have seen from the government? Just kind of following up on his, like, what's the best thing you've seen from the federal level that they've done to be helpful right now?
Question.
ETAC, no. From DOE, I mean, it's been good. Well, just generally.
I mean, I guess I would start by just saying a willingness to engage in the dialogue and really try to brainstorm and tackle these things, because we don't have all the solutions, right? I might have a good idea, Rich might have one, Michelle might have one, but none of them are great fits, right? And so we had these relationships with people, whether they were at the National Security Council or at Department of Energy or CISA or wherever, where we can go and have that dialogue, because I think there has to be a change in the recognition of the burden on private sector as a target of adversaries, and we have to evolve from government supporting government to government supporting government and industry in unique ways now, and faster, that those conversations are the only way, in my mind, that lead to that change.
I think about Puerto Rico probably tested the industry and government partnership
Maria?
beyond anything that you could kind of imagine, just given that scenario of an island, no power, how do we move assets? I mean, there was equivalent of like 2 D-Day invasions of getting bucket trucks from the mainland using government, using military ships and planes to get people and trucks and equipment to that island. There were people that spent more than a year there trying to fix it, and that
We're still there.
they're still there. Will they ever get paid? We'll see. But reimbursement was a whole nother problem. But those are the types of things that if we didn't have the relationships from the events leading up to that, so each one we have to learn from, and exercising has been a major focus of bringing senior executives and government officials in, because as we joke, we don't like to exchange business cards on the tarmac. You want to know who these people are, and you want to know how you have to engage with them. And we've had tremendous government partners. Since I've been doing this, I'm on my third administration, and there is a consistency. We have to keep the consistent folks in that understand and have the institutional knowledge, and then we have to have great leaders that understand and listen to industry to carry it forward, because we can't do it ourselves. They can't do it ourselves, and ultimately we have to get power on as fast and quickly and safely as possible. So coordination, I think, has greatly improved because we're talking to each other on a regular basis. It's not just after a major event. And
I just don't want to have to learn those lessons from responding to a similar sized cyber event as we do for a natural disaster, because we all see the threat, and it would be a shame if we wait until something happens to do something about it.
And workforce is a huge issue in that component. We've had on the physical and storm side an incredibly robust mutual assistance program. We've talked a little bit about that today. The industry has worked on building a similar cyber mutual assistance component, and what does that look like, and all the complications and legal frameworks, and how do you move people, or how can one utility's experts support another? That's in a challenge. But we have a serious workforce issue on the physical side. You have linemen and crew and wrench turners and the folks that built the grid retiring at an alarming rate as they reach retirement, and how do we recruit new people into that? And then on the cyber side, there's hundreds of thousands of open cybersecurity jobs in this country. How do we attract the best talent to work on these issues as well? So that's why workforce is an issue.
And I just add that I think the government, to include federal, state, local, tribal, and critical infrastructure, are looking at polycrisis, so multi-sector, multi-regions. It could be a variety of different places around the country that don't have power. And what does that look like? So we're not just treating it like a natural disaster and drawing a circle and saying the power's out here as well as comms. It's continuity of the economy, continuity of the communities. What does it look like? And there's going to be, I think we're all getting to the point to include the federal government when you have to make those decisions, who's going to get power and who's not. I mean, that's a reality that we have to put in as part of our exercises, as part of our consequence management. It's not just crisis management, communications of who you're going to call. So who you're going to get around the table from the infrastructure to work with the federal government to understand Homeland Defense and their priorities and make those key decisions. So I think we've been moving there in the right direction with any of the administrations.
Inez Jordan-Dube with JP Morgan Chase. Thank you so much for your remarks and your emphasis on cross-sector collaboration. It is much needed. If I could ask, in the last year, we've seen a little bit of a slowdown on U.S. policy and regulatory in the cyberspace. That doesn't mean it's completely dead. And, we've heard news of CERCIA being finalized by April of 2026. Utilities, finance were heavily regulated sectors, and with regulation, there can often be very good intent and not necessarily always good effect. But sometimes, like let's say in the case of CERCIA, the idea is that DHS would have a really good picture across the country of who's suffering from cyber incidents of different kinds and relatively quick speed of reporting. Our sector had pushback on certainly the scope of CERCIA. I know yours did as well. Can you speak a little bit to the tension between regulated entities and regulated reporting And sometimes the benefit of that collaboration and being able to pick up the phone in the event of an incident and calling up our government partners, I think we can all see that there's an upside to it, but there's also some real downsides from the industry perspective. And where does that tension kind of pan out, especially in this slightly deregulatory environment? Thank you.
I'll start. It's a great question. I think the interesting thing about regulation is when you feel like you have to do it, you might not see the value or the benefit that you're getting in doing it. And where we maintain open relationship and an ability to collaborate on those topics, we generally strive for more mutual benefit. And so I think one of the risks I see in CERCIA moving forward is there might be, in the near term, a vision of how that requirement provides mutual benefit. But in at least my opinion, over time, as that regulatory mechanism stays in place, there is a waning interest in making it mutually beneficial. And so my fear is it becomes just a number that we report over and over again, and there's no actual real value to it because all parties involved end up mindlessly filling it out as a regulatory mechanism. I hope I'm wrong, and I hope that we are able to maintain the good intentions of that program and find ways that it's valuable back to the private sector in a way that enumerates risk and factors into insurance or other mechanisms that would benefit the private sector as well as the reporting to government benefiting them.
I was getting flashbacks as you were asking this question from trying to negotiate that legislation and saying, here's all the reporting, in our case, the power sector already does to DOE, FERC. We have OE 417s, which are required in the event of any power outages, and that spins up a whole bunch of press stories all the time. And so we just said, look, if we're already giving this to the Department of Energy, can the Department of Energy just give it to DHS and to CISA? Like why are you making us do both, and then we don't know that you're also looking at it, right? And so that's where that harmonization debate can. I'm sure you're making the same case for SEC and Treasury and so on and so forth. And so again, that is the competing turf war of agencies that want everything. And we're just saying, like, if it's going in one place behind the government curtain, can the government behind the curtain be looking at it holistically and not make industry sort of just now, why are we hiring compliance people when we need to be, hiring threat hunters and smart folks to be actually defending?
I think our last draft of our cyber incident response plan had 8 different organizations that we have to report to within 24 or 36 hours. It becomes a giant paperwork drill.
It's never clear when the clock starts.
But maybe we could
something like that.
Maybe we could use AI. Maybe we could just AI it.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
So we're over time, but I do want to get to the online question that's been very patient with me. Role of cyber insurance. You touched on it briefly, Jeff. What is the role? Because we've been kind of going back and forth between physical kinetic risk and business risk, and just vacillating back and forth. So what role does a cyber insurance play in some of the hardening that we've talked about thus far?
Well, we have it.
Do you have
an active war clause?
I think that's an evolving issue as well. I think different insurers are pricing that risk differently, are covering different aspects of that risk. And so I think we're seeing the policies get more defined, and hopefully that leads to an effectiveness. I don't know if I have an answer of how that fits in today. It certainly is something that can help mitigate risk, but I don't think that the solution exists today to say the right cyber policies are available and cost effective to maintain customer rates while appropriately addressing the risks that we're facing.
So we're at time, but Michelle, and yeah, if you guys have any final comments, I know we kind of cut you off halfway through your panel because we were very.
Oh, no.
But we give you a chance to just closing thoughts or anything.
I hope you go into national security. I hope you, and on either side, government or critical infrastructure, every day is different. If you like challenges, if you like thinking strategy, if you like working within your corporations, if you like doing policy, there's so many opportunities. So I just, and if you'd like to, think, and you're not fearful, because people ask me, how do you sleep at night? Well, you do, because you're doing something proactive, right? And you're getting people around the table, and you're talking, and you're having ideas. And it's about the world that we live in. And so if you're passionate about it, you get fire in the belly, please continue.
Just thank you. It's always great. Obviously, we love talking about this stuff, so we're happy to keep that going in the future.
I got nothing on. They've said it all.
You said it all.
All right, for the folks online, we're going to take a 10-minute break here, and we will be back with one more panel, so make sure that you stay online. We'll be back shortly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for that great discussion, the panel break. I think we've got everybody online. Let's do a quick mic check. If we can do a mic check. Caitlin, start with you.
Can everybody hear me? Yes. Got it.
All right. Sean?
Testing.
Great.
Sweet.
You got me? Nope. There it is. Let's do it different.
And then
Your turn.
Yeah, testing, can you hear me?
Great. All right. Caitlin, over to you.
awesome. Thank you all for staying with us this morning. We're your second and last panel. And I realized this morning, as I was giving opening remarks, I never introduced myself, which is what happens on a Friday morning. Hello, I am Caitlin Clark. I'm a Senior Director of Cybersecurity Services here at Venable, and I'm excited to lead the second panel today, which promises to be a critical and timely discussion on balancing regulations for competing pressures. We just heard in the previous panel a little bit of a conversation about the growing energy demand, but we're going to dive into that in this panel. And as I said earlier, as we navigate increasingly interconnected and digital worlds, the stakes around how we regulate critical sectors and services have never been higher. On one hand, we face real and growing concerns about security, which we heard this morning from Christine, from threat actors attacking our energy infrastructure on a seemingly constant basis. On the other hand, there is the need to ensure resilience in our systems, supply chains, and our communities. And then there is demand from industry, innovators, and the public for faster and more capable AI systems, for more cryptocurrency, and that demand is driving unprecedented investment in energy use. So the question really becomes for us today, how do we strike the right balance? How do we protect critical systems without slowing progress that bring enormous benefit? How do we ensure that regulation keeps pace with innovation without stifling it? These aren't easy questions, and there are no one-size-fits-all answers, but they are the exact kinds of challenges that thoughtful conversations like the one we're going to have today can begin to unpack. And I'm honored to be joined today by a group of experts from both owners and operators and the government. I'm joined today by Kate Mabbitt, the Director of Security Strategy and Financial Planning at American Electric Power. Thank you for joining us today, Kate. We have Kyle Pfeiffer, who graciously is joining us online. Hopefully family is doing better. He is a senior advisor for national security and emerging risk at Southern California Edison. And we talked a little bit about state government in the last panel, and I'm honored to have Sean Ewert, the Assistant Secretary for Energy right here in New York State, joining us today. So together we're going to explore where regulatory frameworks are really succeeding as this growth, demand growth is occurring, where it could be lacking, and what a balanced approach may look like. So with that, let's get started. And I'm going to start with you, Sean. Demands on the electric grid in New York are great. According to some news reports, in 2022, there were just 6 large load projects that used a significant amount of energy for manufacturing, data centers, or cryptocurrency mining, totaling 1,045 megawatts. In 2025, that growth has grown to a reported 20 large loads, totaling 4,400 megawatts of demand. And I know the governor has been quoted to say that she's embracing AI because whoever harnesses the power of AI today will own the next generations of power. So given the competing demands here and the direction, how is the state looking at balancing the load growth coming from data centers and the need for AI with security and resilience?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be here, and it's an important topic. So in New York, we have, I think a number of really great things happening simultaneously. We have tremendous economic development that we're seeing. I think everybody's heard of the Micron plant that's being developed in upstate New York. And we have a number of sort of manufacturing facilities, certainly AI, and then also we have our ambitious climate targets as well. That's driving, building electrification, vehicle electrification, and increasingly sort of this interest in, in distributed energy technologies and VPPs, and all of this, sort of puts increasing pressure on, I think a traditional utility grid. So I think that as we're looking at sort of how to manage this transition where we see, the need to move off of traditional fuel sources and move towards renewables and distributed resources, our challenge is making that work alongside this economic development. And I think that all of the sort of load growth that you're referencing really is sort of fundamentally a reflection of the tremendous impact that our economic development priorities have had. So, and I think that the governor has said that our real sort of goal here is to be able to grow the grid and green it at the same time. And so we need to recognize that we're not going to be sort of reducing energy demand anytime soon. Instead, we need to be smarter at managing it. And I take a step back and I think about, all of these new resources, increasing electrification both at home and in roads and then also in industry. And I think about, the 2003 blackout and what would happen if something similar happened today. And I think that the impact of that would be even more catastrophic, especially as you just move towards this all-electric infrastructure. And so for us, and when we think about cybersecurity, specifically within the utility sector, we think about it as being a necessary, sort of a foundational, I think, platform to enable our clean energy transition. So in my position, doing energy policy for the governor, I think about cybersecurity as being, an enabler for us. You cannot move towards, an all renewable and all zero emission grid if it's not reliable. And so that reliability needs to take into account both the sort of nuts and bolts of how the actual, electrons move, but then also the security of that infrastructure. So to me, that's really how we're looking at it. We've taken some steps. We have a lot, still to come. But last year we implemented some new regulations that require our utility companies to sort of treat cybersecurity events, specifically those that have an operational technology impact, similar to how you would, a hurricane. And so we now have in place emergency response, protocols at the utility level, which have already come into play. Just in terms of responding to emergency events, we now have sort of an ordered process to respond, with the sort of assumption that any particular incident could be a cyber attack, which is very helpful for us as we're doing sort of threat management. We also have a number of different policies in flight related to water utilities that we're sort of working through at the moment, and I think we're really excited about looking at new avenues to sort of ensure that we are maintaining a cybersecure first posture as we're managing this energy transition. So
I'm gonna pull on the last panel a little bit. There was a discussion about the role of federal regulators versus state. Since you are here as a state representative, and you just talked about some of the regulations that New York is putting in there, how do you see the federal regulation of energy from NERC and FERC and the state level regulation that you're putting in on energy utilities regarding cybersecurity? How do you see those coming together? And we've heard a lot about this thing called harmonization, which I don't want it to become a buzzword. It really is just about let's try to use same terminology, timelines, and not go completely different from one another. How are you having those conversations at the state level and the federal level?
Yeah, I mean, so look, the first instance is we don't want to be duplicative. We just want this to work. And so as part of the development of our initial regulations, we certainly did consult with folks at the federal level, wanting to make sure that we weren't sort of stepping on any toes and making sort of unnecessary headaches for our partners on the regulated end. And we also work very closely with with our counterparts at the federal level, even to this day, about that sort of harmonization process. We want to make sure that from state to state that it's at least clear. And I also think that there's sort of a jurisdictional bright line around specifically our distribution utilities, and those are sort of all regulated at the state level. When you get into generation and transmission, you run into different challenges. But I think that one of the things that has been really important for us is to actually take some of the federal regulations that are applied at the generation and transmission level, and just make sure that our distribution utilities are sort of looking at the same universe. So for us, it's about sort of wanting to make sure that there aren't gaps at the state level without creating an additional hurdle, for folks who are already covered by federal jurisdiction.
And we also heard in the last panel about the importance of public-private partnerships. So as New York is building out this strategy of, really the electrification strategy I don't know forgive me, I don't know the name of the specific strategy, but how is New York interacting with the private sector as you're building out and as you're going forward?
Well, I mean, it's easy for me to say. I'd like to say it's going really well, and everybody loves us. So I think that's it. But I think, look, we consult with them, all the time. We engage with our regulated partners. In fact, many years ago when I was in the legislature, I think the first phone call I made when we began working on cybersecurity was to Dragos, just to sort of like make sure that we were checking the boxes. So. So we work closely with them, and frankly, I think that the posture that we've been taking is that we appreciate that our utility companies have a tremendous amount to lose if there is some sort of a catastrophic incident. And so what we want to do is to sort of create the infrastructure that allows us to sort of help them through any sort of an incident along those lines. And so we're trying to take the posture that we want this to be a dialogue so that we can be additive to that process. Again, we don't want paperwork for the sake of paperwork. This is really designed to protect New Yorkers fundamentally, and to make sure that we are maintaining system reliability sort of across the board.
Thank you, Sean. So I'm going to move to my private sector partners now, Kate and Kyle. We've heard a little bit about the investments that need to be made in the grid for both further growth and in cybersecurity. But when budgets are tight, How is prioritization going within companies when you're thinking about upgrading infrastructure, meeting demand growth, and investing in cybersecurity? How are those conversations happening right now? If I can start with you, Kate, and then I'll turn to Kyle.
They are, okay, double check. Mike, you can hear me? Great. Those conversations are critical, and I love your point about being an enabler. Security needs to be an enabler, and that also means that we cannot become the department of no. I'm quoting an old friend when they say security should not be the department of no, it should be the department of yes and, like any great team. It's yes, I want to support this, and I'm going to need to do X, Y, and Z in order to enable it. Part of that conversation then is recognizing, to your point, Caitlin, just the enormous growth that we are going to see. At American Electric Power, one of the largest investor-owned utilities in the United States, we're present in 11 different states and run the largest transmission network in the US. The customer requests that we have in our queue right now would double our peak demand load. Double. You think about how slow and incremental change has been over the years, and now we're talking about an absolute shift. That requires us to think differently, to partner with our regulators differently. And it's incumbent on both of us to have that deep relationship where I'm reaching out to my regulators to ensure that we are aligned and that the efforts we're undertaking are complementary, not contradictory. Informing that legislation is key. When it comes to the budget standpoint, it's being very clear with large load customers in particular how we need to partner to ensure that our ratepayers are not held responsible for that extraordinary growth. We need tariff structures, we need regulation structures that allow these new large load customers to contribute appropriately to that large load growth. And it's ensuring that we meet capacity demands while not creating undue burden for our ratepayers. Kyle, I'm curious from your point of view, how you're approaching this in California.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. And once again, let me just say, I'm very sorry I can't be with all of you today. We had a bug run through the household. I've got young kids and just couldn't make it to New York. So my sincere apologies for not being there in person. Kate, similar, although SCE is a little bit different. So we had the luxury of only having one Public Utilities Commission because we were just in California. And in our service territory, which is much of Southern California, we are seeing a lot of demand driven by data centers, but it's actually not the primary driver for us. Other electrification initiatives are the big driver in SoCal. And so we have an interesting position where when we talk with the PUC, some of our peer utilities like PG&E, which serves most of Northern California, the Bay Area, they're taking the lead a little bit on some of the data center discussions. But we, just like everybody else in the US, are having constant conversations about balancing skyrocketing demand, reliability, and security. So at SCE, we project we'll have a 75% increase in demand by 2045 in our service territory. So not quite double, but really going up there. And I'll say, I actually went and looked back at the estimates for the past couple of years, and they've been growing over the past 3 years. So I suspect that 75% may shift up a little bit in the future. But listen, our cyber team is engaged in grid planning and engineering processes from the beginning to ensure that cyber is considered right up front. We have a really strong relationship with our Public Utilities Commission, the California Public Utilities Commission, and with CAISO to ensure that cyber is top of mind in grid planning activities. I actually have a person on my team. I'd say 50 to 75% of his job is specifically engaging on cyber issues with the state for our company. So we're trying to take a very proactive approach. That said, we really are still playing catch up, just given the monumental shift in demand growth and the changes that we're seeing in the grid, particularly a grid that has a lot of inverter-based resources and a lot of renewables being deployed, some of which we control, some of which we don't.
I just wanted to say, I think it's a great point, right? As we're, balancing all of these different priorities, one of the things that we've had to do in New York is on the regulatory side is to frankly beef up our understanding even of cybersecurity and the importance that we're able to sort of make decisions with scarce resources and do so in partnership with our, with the regulated community. And so I would just sort of put out, generally speaking, a call that your state governments need, cybersecurity professionals to come and work there so that we can make those sorts of decisions.
So we'll put in another plug for the workforce from the previous panel. It is, when we talk about scarce resources, it's not just money, it really is people. So those of the students in the room and online, this is a public service call to you to join us all in the cybersecurity professional path.
If I can
go for it, Kate.
If I can foot stomp that, don't see an engineering background as a prerequisite.
Yeah.
For context, I was a French major in college. Things change.
I studied journalism.
I'm political science.
And there you have it. So that diversity of skills can actually be incredibly powerful when it's coupled with a cybersecurity background as well. So don't let that deter you. If anything, see it as an opportunity to provide that different point of view and gain some new skills going in a new direction.
And I will out that Kyle and I actually worked together at FEMA about 10 years ago. So we are also emergency management, incident management professionals. So you never know where you're going to end up, and the folks that you meet along the way that you're still in touch with. I want to talk a little bit about, Michelle brought this up in her panel briefly. She said secure by design. That conversation has really, a lot of it's been focused on software secure by design. As companies are building and upgrading facilities to meet the energy growth, the electricity growth demand, you said cybersecurity should not be the Department of No. Completely agree. But how early are we considering secure by design principles in just even the, we talked about engineering, in the engineering of the new facilities and the new components of the grid as they're being developed?
Absolutely. I'm really proud of how American Electric Power has prioritized cybersecurity, physical security, resilience, and partnership. This is absolutely a CEO and a board focus area priority. It's not an afterthought. It's not something we consider after the fact. We don't make investments and then think how to build security into it. We're not doing Band-Aids anymore. That doesn't work. We have to make it a cornerstone upon which the foundation is built. And that means being a good partner. Again, it's me recognizing that I have to work with and be creative and flexible with my internal AAP partners as well as my regulators. That means that binary solutions are no longer sufficient. I can't come in with a rigid framework about how we have to solve the problem. I have to come in with that curiosity and mindset that there are a number of different ways we can solve for this, but it requires me to be at the front end design, ensuring that we have talked through and considered what threat we're trying to mitigate and how we're going to respond if a bad day does happen.
Kyle, is your company taking a similar approach?
Yeah, for sure. But hey, I don't know that we actually define secure by design. So maybe I'll take a stab at that real quick,
Yes.
just in case, because I know there's some students in the audience. So feel free, Kate or others, to correct me. But secure by design is really ensuring that cybersecurity is part of the initial planning and development phases of product or service or what have you, rather than sort of being bolted on as an afterthought or added on the back end. So that's my quick definition. Anybody want to disagree? No? Okay, good. Hey, we have a very proactive CEO as well. I'd say that the AEP and SCE CEOs, as well as Southern and Berkshire are represented in the room. We have the privilege of having an engaged C-suite who are really quite interested in cybersecurity and understand the true risk profile that we face. We focus on key secure by design principles, right? Least privilege, data integrity, hardware-based security from the outset. But this is really challenging given the scope and scale of the grid, right? Running the largest engineered systems in the country with so many new technologies and components coming on, it gets really challenging. We really have to focus on cost. We have to make a case within the company, with our customers, with our shareholders, but once again, most importantly, to the regulator, that secure by design, or maybe secure by design approaches are warranted up front, even if that means that there's a small time delay or maybe a small cost increase. So I'll say one thing we've actually done at SCE is we've got our regulators in a room every 6 months in a secure virtual cyber reading room where we talk about our incident response plans. We talk about the threats du jour and the things that we're seeing. And in fact, we've also set up classified briefings for our utility commissioners with government partners to help them understand the threat landscape that we're seeing, and then we're able to provide some additional context on how some of those threats could manifest in our network and ultimately disrupt systems. That's been a powerful approach for us. And when we talk about working with the federal government and what can the federal government do for you, sometimes it's not always abundantly clear. Also having worked in the federal government for almost all of my career, I've only been at SCE for a year, but having them there to talk about the threat, that is a key thing that really lends credence to what we're telling our utility commissioners.
Yeah, Kyle, I think you're spot on. It's that recognition and understanding of what the threat environment is, what threats we are facing, how that manifests within our system, and then building the appropriate defenses against that. And it's that recognition of balance. What's the impact, what's the likelihood, and what is my most appropriate mitigation that is respectful of my ratepayer and also ensures a secure, reliable, resilient grid.
So as we're hearing that risk calculus that Kate just laid out, where do you see, Sean, the role of the state coming into that and potentially the role of the government in driving secure by design?
I think that it's, look, I think it's all about sort of how you balance that and prioritize it. To your point about, ratepayers, sort of number one, and then also about sort of the host of sort of competing interests that go into sort of, utility rate cases or even the sort of economics of a project. But I think that as we're sort of moving forward into this, into the digital world with AI and all of this, I think that we are increasingly seeing that this sort of, secure by design paradigm is kind of table stakes for project development. And so I think that, I don't think that New York is alone, but certainly I like to think that we are at least sort of, in a leadership position here, that our posture as we're engaging with, even developers now is to sort of ask those types of questions and to at least get that conversation going. Because I think that, like I said at the beginning, I don't think that we can really have a sort of cogent transition to a clean energy future without sort of a baseline cybersecurity posture.
So I just want to get back to the ratepayer, or I would like to say myself, because I think I am a ratepayer. Is there a point at which cybersecurity requirements can compromise grid reliability or increase cost to ratepayers? Is there a point at which we get to a tension between that protecting the grid and costs? And how, I'm going to look at my private sector partners here, how would you advise policymakers like Sean about how to navigate those tensions?
I think one of the keys...
I know, sorry.
Well, here we go. I think one of the keys to bear in mind is that I see regulation as the baseline. That is the floor. That is the minimum. I have to be this tall to ride this ride. And I also respect that I need some flexibility in that because I am one of 3,000, as Michelle and Jeff pointed out earlier. It needs to be a flexible solution that's based on my unique circumstances. I can afford something different than a smaller municipal or co-op. And at the same time, that needs to be in balance with serving my customers. So I think the healthy tension there is recognizing that a binary solution is tricky because that could come with unintended consequences and additional cost. It's being very clear in what our intended outcome and goal is. And it's starting with the intended outcome in mind. And then it's building in flexibility to the design to ensure that we can maintain those appropriate costs considerations while still meeting the longer term intent. It's a little bit amorphous, but I'm hopeful.
I think the question is a little bit amorphous, and I think that's, to be honest, it's the, what was it, the $64,000 question from the show when I was growing up is really how, cybersecurity is still considered, I think, in many places a sunken cost, right? And I know when I was in private sector explaining the costs of we need to invest in this, when it was to prevent something that may or may not happen in the future versus business operations right now, that was a really hard conversation to have. I'm looking at Michelle and Brian in the back of the room. It was the same thing with preparedness. the argument of investing in preparedness, what is that going to get me on return of investment? And when you've got a finite budget, sometimes the investment in something that you may not see for 10, 15, 20 years of what that bought me gets dropped for something that you can see immediate return on.
I think the hope is that if I make the right investments and secure myself appropriately, you should never have to see that.
Exactly.
Right? If I do my job right, then it should be extremely difficult for me to prove the negative because I have addressed risk in a way that has protected grid and grid operations.
I think there's, sorry.
Yeah, please, Kyle. No,
Go
no,
ahead,
please.
Kyle, jump in.
No, I was gonna say, I think there's a conversation around risk management and risk acceptance to be had as well. So as maybe some of you know, in California has the highest utility rates in the country. SCE has the lowest of the investor-owned utilities there, but it's not by much. It's a very expensive market. So, and we're also balancing reliability. We're balancing a pretty nasty wildfire risk in our service territory, as you all will remember from January and from other recent past years in California with some of my peers throughout the state. We have to be able to accept some risk. We can't create reliability issues because we're over-investing in cybersecurity. But that said, the cost of cybersecurity does not have to be astronomical. There are some good decisions that we can make to ensure that we're not tripling or quadrupling the cost on the back end or inadvertently creating a reliability or a resiliency issue. One thing I'll maybe mention, sometimes in these discussions, and I'll say particularly in the past year, I've heard the idea of bans pop up quite a bit. So I want to ban a certain technology. I want to ban a certain product from a country that's maybe not trusted. That's often not the best solution. And so a place where we can actually talk about a good cybersecurity practice is, well, how can we containerize that? How can we put a fence around that? How can we still bring that product or that service into the grid while ensuring security? And so once again, this is a great place for government and industry to have conversations around risk management and risk acceptance and cost and reliability.
Kyle brought up one of my next questions, and I'm just going to jump to that since you mentioned it. In the Trump administration's AI action plan, it's specifically called for infrastructure that supports AI development, such as energy and telecommunications, to be free from foreign adversary information and communications technologies and services, just what you were saying, including software and relevant hardware. We've seen legislation regarding the telecommunications sector mandating the removal of certain products from Huawei. We're seeing the FCC taking some action this week on additional products. How are the current regulatory approaches doing enough on the supply chain side? You talked about containerizing. I think that there's a spectrum, as you talked about, of risk management. How is Southern California Edison managing that risk of supply chain and potentially components that some might say that's untrusted? How do you have that on your network? Or on your grid? How are you handling that?
Yeah, sure. Look, in the case of Huawei, ZTE, I think some strong decisions were made there. But in California, we have clean energy targets that we're required to hit by the governor's office and by the PUC. And in order to do that, we're going to put more solar on the grid. But at some point, we really have to up our grid scale batteries. And that's something we're really focused on now and over the next 5 to 7 years. And most of those products and almost all of those components, I think it's something over 90%. I saw a presentation last week from a colleague at Idaho National Laboratory. 90% of the components in batteries that are market deployable for grid scale battery projects right now come from China. So obviously, we're going to have to find a way to work around that. Or, once again, a good role for government is to incentivize domestic production, both on the material side, but also on the finished product side, to ensure that we have trusted vendors for these batteries in the future. And I do worry a little bit that we're not doing enough domestically to incentivize secure supply chains that we feel more comfortable with. And so I think we probably will continue to have some tough conversations. And I think batteries are going to be central to that as we continue with solar deployment, at least in parts of the country, and wind and other IBRs as well. I don't know, Kate, comments on that?
I completely agree with you. I think there's a couple of things. To your point, we need to incentivize onshore, friendshore production. That's not something that starts up overnight. That's not something we can turn on a dime. So we have to start building the momentum in that direction now, recognizing that critical components, batteries in particular, we're going to need more trusted vendors to pull on in order to build the grid of the future. When I think about specific vendors, there's the good, the bad, and the middle. So I think there's a handful that we can agree, this is not safe, this is not wise, don't invest there if you can help it at all. There's the good, and then there's what's in the middle. And to your point, Kyle, it's how do you contain that? How do you put the appropriate security protections around it to enable rapid development while mitigating risk? So part of that is understanding what risk that vendor potentially poses to you, how they're connected to your infrastructure, what role they serve. It's better understanding their connections and their security practices through strong third-party risk management processes, through intelligence partnerships, what have you. And then the other part of that, just as you said a moment ago, I'm stealing all your best material, it's the fundamentals. When you get the fundamentals right, you can buy down risk pretty significantly. So to your point, it's looking at things like access controls and data integrity and data assurance and. When you get the fundamentals right, that sets you up for success, that you can build stronger container around those less trusted partnerships while enabling the growth that's required. But it really does come down to, I think, onshore friendshoring and then knowing what's good, what's bad, and what's in the gray that you have to protect.
I just would like to point, Kyle mentioned the solar panels and the batteries. I would say similar supply chain challenges in cryptocurrency, the crypto miners. That are driving a lot of the digital currency. Those are also, a vast majority of them are made, PRC made. So it's not just, as we're talking about the growth of the grid and the growth of the energy demand, it's not just the transition to clean energy and as we're talking about this trusted versus untrusted, it's also some of the data center and crypto usage here about what's connecting into the grid. So, I mean, that's outside your control. What's connecting to the grid is outside your control. Are you looking at it the same way in terms of just understanding the potential risk?
Anything that touches the grid could pose a risk to me. So I think your call out is spot on. It's not just about moving towards renewable energy sources. That is one aspect of a much larger problem. The large problem is anything that is connected to the grid could pose a vector for risk, a vector for a threat. So I need to be really clear on what I'm allowing to connect to the grid. I also need to be monitoring for anomalous behavior, anomalous activity. I need to understand what normal versus abnormal looks like in my environment. And then I need to be working with my state and federal regulators to understand what my authority is to address that. I spent 10 years of my career at the Department of Defense. I am very clear that I do not have Title 50 authority in a private entity. I don't want it. But I do need to work very closely then with my federal partners and my state partners so that when I recognize that something is potentially malicious, anomalous, concerning, I've got the support I need to contain that potential threat, working closely with other partners, protecting the grid, sounds hyperbolic, but frankly, protecting the nation. How do I make those appropriate steps, knowing what my playbook is? How do I protect appropriately? And how do I identify when something is not normal?
So I think I'm going to turn to you, Sean, on the supply chain piece, and as what Kyle and Kay have talked about potential incentivizing a trusted supply chain. Has New York thought about this as you're doing your clean energy transition, or as more crypto miners come on board in New York? How are you thinking about the supply chain and what is connecting to the grid in New York?
Specifically with respect to the clean energy transition, certainly the supply chain is a critical component for us. And to your point about friendshoring and onshoring, we really want to see as much production happening in state as possible. and from there, sort of looking at regional partnerships. And I think that has, obviously multiple benefits. It's good for, broader economic development. It's good for supply chain security, workforce development. But then also it means that you're able to sort of build in these, whatever the cybersecurity posture that you want into that work stream.
Fantastic. So I'm gonna, before we turn it over for questions, this is where I'm gonna ask all of our panelists, right? If you were going to make a recommendation to policymakers as we are, building out America's leadership in energy, which we know is a priority for this administration, and I think even at state level, at both the federal and state level, what would your recommendation be to them as they're thinking about cybersecurity and energy leadership? Like if they were doing things, I heard Michelle earlier talk about bringing private sector into the National Cyber Incident Response Plan, and a continuity of critical infrastructure plan being some priorities for her. What are some of your priorities that you would like to see from policymakers as they're looking at these challenges?
Step number one, reauthorizing the Cybersecurity Information Security Sharing Act 2015. That would be very helpful.
And not confuse it with the agency.
Correct.
Acronyms.
Yes.
This was Michelle's point on acronyms earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. So that provides protections to the private sector for sharing potentially sensitive data with the government. So think about me monitoring my environment. It's making sure that I can share that information with the government without being held liable. I recognize that I am not perfect. I'm never going to be perfect. I need to know that I'm not going to be punished for sharing something that can better protect the nation. I need to know I'm not going to be penalized for that. There needs to be trust both ways, that I can share sensitive information about how I'm operating and that the government is going to help protect that. Not only treat that data appropriately, it's not classified, but it is sensitive, and that could present security risks for me. So that's essentially what CISA 2015 is doing. It's providing that protection.
Right. So I've heard make sure the private sector is part of the National Cyber Incident Response Plan. Look at continuity of critical infrastructure, which is the second time in 2 weeks I've heard someone bring up, we need to look at continuity across sector. Reauthorizing the Cyber Information Sharing Act of 2015. I will say that fully because I think it's important to say the acronym so as to not confuse. I am talking about a legislative authority that provides liability protection for information sharing related to cyber threat indicators and defensive measures. I am not talking about a component of the Department of Homeland Security. Sean, do you have, you are a policymaker. What is?
Give myself recommendations all day long. But no, I think maybe I'll give one to the private sector, which is the sort of, the best way to engage with folks like me, at least, is just like very constant and clear communication. We don't like surprises in our world, and so I would say that in blue sky days or times of crisis, we just want clear, constant communication, and the sort of energy industry partners that we have in our space that are successful in that. I think we're able to have like a really robust conversation about how to sort of turn that engagement around into if needed, productive regulation that sort of expands, or also sort of helps hone in areas that are doing okay and that don't need our sort of input. So I think that's the key.
Kyle.
I think Kate said it was CISA 2015. For those who work with me, know that that's basically all I've talked about since about March, and unfortunately didn't do enough talking. So to your point about continued, clear, consistent communications, we'll stay on the path. I'll say, and this goes a little bit to the Energy Threat Analysis Center, the ETAC comments that Jeff and Michelle made in the last panel. I think a fundamental recognition that the game has changed. And that the next major nation-state conflict is going to involve the energy sector, and it's it's going to probably be a primary entry point or a primary focus area for our adversaries. And so ensuring we have a seat at the table, ensuring that we're making meaningful connections, ensuring that there's some stability and continuity in government programs and personnel, I think is quite important from the SCE perspective.
Thank you. So we have 5 priorities. Reauthorize Cyber Information Sharing Act of 2015. I'm going to put up the constant communications so that we are not, as Jeff and Michelle said in the previous panel, sharing business cards on the tarmac and having those open lines of communication to really understand where things are working, and perhaps thank you, government, for your offer to help, but we don't need you here, versus areas where it is important for the government to lean in. As we've talked about, Kate does not have authorities to do things on her network, nor does Sean, but we need to have conversations about what is the different roles and responsibilities in protecting networks. I'm gonna put the continuity of critical infrastructure plan on as number 3. We've talked about the dependencies today. We've talked about AI driving this demand. Imagine what would happen if companies are investing in AI and investing in those technologies to help us with manufacturing and with other business functions, and we lose the grid. Think about what that does to the AI and the technology firms. It's not just the one way. So I think that's an important thing that Michelle talked about earlier that I want to make sure that we're tracking. And I will say workforce as another area of we need to have continued focus on that from policymakers at all levels of government and within the private sector. And I think now we're going to open it up to questions. Ross is doing a great job walking around with the mic, so if you have any questions.
Anybody have any questions?
I know it's been a long morning.
Check my online. Anybody online have any questions? All right, I'll ask one.
Got one over here too.
There we go.
Hi, just on the workforce development question, what would be some good resources that you would recommend for people in the audience to bring back to their organizations to get people who might not be on the security analyst side of it, but might be decision makers, or I'm an insurance company, how do I better train my underwriters? Things like that. Like, would you have any recommendations there to help cross-train to help support workforce development?
Maybe I'll ask my private sector partners. Go ahead.
Yeah, I actually last week went to an hour-and-a-half executive exercise sponsored by SANS that showed, I guess this is a cyber group, so a scattered spider telephone attack for credential harvesting at a real utility company that was, anonymized. Really interesting, really focused on helping executive understand why it's important to invest in training, why your help desk can be a weak point in having somebody call up and socially engineer a way to get creds in, and why all this cyber stuff is so important, to put it pretty bluntly. So SANS is a good resource, particularly executive tabletop exercises. That's maybe one you could check out.
I think for me, I'm just going to speak from my own lived experience, which was I do not code. I cannot code. I'm not a SOC engineer. I'm none of those things. What I do have a background in is in incident management, in planning, in training and exercises. And what I found was that from that background, I had the ability to translate between very technical employees and non-technical employees, which turned out to be a skill that a lot of people need, that really honing in on what is the information that drives decisions and helping people focus in on that. There's a lot of information out there. There was times where I was challenged with my security team folks and going, I don't need to know all of that. I just need, what is the potential impact? What decisions do we like? And being that kind of interlocutor between technology teams and, risk management, C-suite. I think one of the things that happens in cybersecurity is people assume all cybersecurity jobs are hands-on keyboard, computer science, computer engineering. It is not. And so I think one of the most important things to do is to really understand that there are very different roles in cybersecurity and encourage people who don't have that hands-on keyboard engineering coding background to see themselves in cyber, because I think a lot of times they don't. And I'm also going to speak as a woman in cyber. And bear with me for a second. I never applied for jobs on job announcements if I didn't think I made every single qualification that was listed in that job opportunity. If I looked at 10 experiences and I was like, well, I have 9 out of the 10, I don't have the 10, I didn't put myself forward. And I think that's something that happens a lot in cybersecurity, or people who are interested in cybersecurity may not see all 10 skills on their resume, and so they think, I'm not going to try for that. And as decision makers or policymakers or hiring managers, I challenge us all to look for those diverse experiences, those diverse backgrounds. That person who may have 8 out of 10 might be your superstar. Somebody who has 10 out of 10 might have all the certifications in the world, but they can't speak to others. And so, part of the workforce challenge is on both sides. It's on the hiring manager side. It's on the supply side of people seeing themselves in cyber. And, I'm look around the room and I see a lot of young women in here. And I'm going to challenge you to take a risk as you are looking at jobs. Don't be the person holding yourself back. Take that leap. What source is going to happen? They're going to say no. You can move on. But sometimes they're going to say yes. And sorry for my soapbox. I just had to do that. Go ahead, Kate.
I love your soapbox. And part of that is looking at those list of qualifications and saying, what do I know today and what do I think I can learn? And given the right time and right environment, I could learn most things. I mean, clearly, I'm not going to be a PhD rocket scientist. That's not in the cards. But most things, at least at a cursory level, enough to be proficient, enough to be a translator, if given the right environment with the right support, don't hesitate to push into a new space and challenge yourself to grow in a way that you wouldn't have expected. I think SANS courses are excellent. The National Security Agency has an entire external website of centers of academic excellence. Those are all vetted programs from the National Security Agency that have a focus on cyber operations or security engineering, a host of different things that can provide a great wealth of resources. Several government agencies had educational content on their websites, like CISA, not to be confused with, with the legislation. There's a number of different places you can get that experience, you can get that exposure. Part of it is recognizing that you don't have to be hands-on keyboard. You don't have to be a computer scientist. You don't have to be an engineer to bring a valuable skill to the table. And that can become a real weak spot if we only have a cyber workforce that has one specific background, one specific set of experiences, one specific resume. The people that are the most creative are the folks that aren't so steeped in how it's always been done. They can bring a different point of view. So I'm the queen of silly questions in meetings, but I find that that often leads us to a new place to understand what our end goal or intent is, and that drives everybody to think a little bit more creatively and flexibly about how you solve for it. And we're all better served by that.
Any other questions?
Very long answer to your question about workforce. Sorry about that.
We've got one more question, and then I think we've outkicked our coverage in this room, so we'll turn it over to Irva for closing comments. For Sean, you live in a state that touches multiple other states. Energy has no borders. How are you working closely with your state counterparts, both across political and regulatory lines, to really make sure that it makes sense as you are developing some of these new regulations?
Well, not just states. We also border Ontario and Quebec, which sort of introduces those complexities. I think for us, we lean very heavily on our federal counterparts, with the sort of interstate, transmission of gas or electricity. So we lean very heavily on them, and we work closely also with our independent system operator, the NISO. I think what we're really trying to sort of create in New York State is an environment that within within the sort of the confines of our borders, our regulations are not less than what we would expect at the federal level, and we're wanting to make sure that that is something that is replicatable across state lines, again, without sort of creating redundant paperwork or creating sort of any sort of I guess unnecessary cost on ratepayers. So that's the balance here. We want I guess New York State to be familiar to folks in the energy industry so that they're able to come and do business here in an environment that is fundamentally protective of the people that we have to serve electricity to.
Thank you, Kyle.
Good afternoon, everyone. And now we are ready to conclude our conference on cyber regulation and the electrical grid. First, a huge thank you to all of you, our attendees, speakers, both here in New York City and joining virtually. Your engagement, thoughtful questions, and commitment to these topics were truly appreciated. It's just a couple of key takeaways. We started with our threat briefing earlier in the morning, and then we had our first panel where we explored the updates on cyber regulation and the grid. We talked about compliance realities, and we just concluded our second panel. And I'm confident that the conversations sparked here today have not only been thought-provoking, but will also fuel different ways to think about policy and the electrical grid. Because we're not just talking about theoretical problems, we're discussing the lights, the water, and the very foundation of modern society. And I'd like to express my sincere thanks once more to our esteemed partners, Venable, and the Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law for their partnership and for hosting us today. So thank you all.